This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely fictional and invented. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Dante Cuso leaned close to Isabella Morti in that narrow staff corridor and said, quietly, like a man confirming a grocery order, once the documents are signed, she won't be able to challenge anything. The doctors I have on retainer will certify the instability within 72 hours. Pregnancy makes it cleaner. Nobody questions a woman who can't cope. Isabella didn't flinch. She said, and the baby? Dante said the baby becomes leverage. We don't need to touch her, we just need her signature and the right medical file. 11 minutes. That's how long Evelyn Morti had, until she was supposed to walk down the aisle and marry the man whose voice she was now hearing through a cracked service door. 5 months pregnant, white dress, grandmother's locket around her neck, and the recording button already pressed. If you were standing in her shoes right now, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel go places most people are afraid to follow. Hit the like button if you're already feeling this one, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened inside that estate on the morning of the wedding that never was will stay with you, long after it's over. The Morti estate sat on 40 acres of coastal Connecticut property that Evelyn's father had purchased 30 years ago when he was 31 years old, operating 3 shipping docks, 1 import-export firm, and enough quiet arrangements with certain government officials that nobody looked too hard at his cargo manifests. Leonard Morti had built everything from the ground up with the kind of patience that made other men nervous. He didn't rush. He didn't threaten. He simply outlasted everyone who tried to stand in front of him, and by the time he died 18 months ago, the Morti family controlled 7 port facilities along the northeastern seaboard, 2 private equity vehicles, a commercial real estate portfolio that stretched from Providence to Philadelphia, and relationships with people whose names never appeared in newspapers but whose phone calls got answered on the first ring. Evelyn had been running it all since the funeral. She was 34. She had her father's stillness and her mother's temper, though she'd spent most of her adult life learning to keep the temper buried. She wasn't warm in the way that made strangers comfortable immediately. She was the kind of woman who listened more than she talked, who remembered details other people forgot, who could walk into a room full of men twice her age and within 20 minutes have a clearer picture of who trusted whom and who was lying than anyone else in the building. Her father had recognized it when she was 19 and had quietly, methodically handed her more and more responsibility until by the time she was 30, she was effectively running operations while he handled relationships and public appearances. She hadn't planned to get married at 34. She hadn't planned to fall for Dante Cuso at all. He came into her world 18 months before the wedding, introduced by a mutual contact at a private investment conference in Boston. He was 40, Sicilian-American, the kind of handsome that aged well and knew it, operating a legitimate shipping logistics firm out of New York with enough reach into the northeastern supply chain that a conversation with him was genuinely useful. He was sharp. He was funny in a dry, unshowy way. He didn't perform for her the way most men did when they figured out who she was. He just talked to her like she was a person he found interesting, and for a woman who had spent 2 years absorbing grief and running a complex empire with a straight face, being found genuinely interesting by someone who didn't want anything from her felt, briefly, like oxygen. She knew his family background. She wasn't naive. The Cuso name carried weight in certain circles that had nothing to do with shipping logistics, and she'd done her due diligence before their third conversation. The landscape she operated in wasn't populated by people with clean hands. Her father had known that, accepted it, worked within it. She had made the same peace. What mattered was whether a man's word held, whether his loyalty was real, whether he understood the difference between alliance and consumption. She had believed Dante understood that difference. She had been wrong in a way so thorough it was almost architectural. The morning of the wedding, Evelyn woke at 5:45 without an alarm. She lay still for 3 minutes, hand resting on the curve of her stomach, feeling the particular heaviness of a day she'd been building toward for 6 months. The event staff had been on the ground since 4. The floral arrangements alone had taken 3 days to install. Her dress, her grandmother Cecilia's altered gown, ivory silk, with hand-stitched Venetian lace hung on the back of the ensuite door. 200 guests were scheduled to arrive by 11. The ceremony was at noon. She felt good. That was the thing she would remember afterward, with a bitterness she couldn't fully name. She had felt settled, calm, certain in a way she'd rarely felt certain about personal things. She'd allowed herself, for exactly one morning, to believe that the life she was stepping into was something solid and real and chosen freely. She went through the motions of the morning deliberately. Coffee with her mother Eleanor in the small sitting room off the east wing at 6:15. They didn't talk about feelings, they weren't that kind of family, but Eleanor held her hand for a moment across the table and said quietly, "Your father would have liked him." Evelyn had nodded and said, "I know," and she'd believed it. Isabella arrived at 7 with the hairstylist and a bottle of champagne she wasn't supposed to open until after the ceremony. She was 28, 6 years younger than Evelyn, and she looked, as she always had, like a lighter-toned version of their mother's softer features, quicker smile, the kind of person who filled rooms with energy before she'd even finished entering them. Evelyn had always felt a complicated tenderness toward her sister. They were not close in the easy, effortless way some sisters were. They had spent too many years on different frequencies, Isabella wanting warmth and spontaneity, Evelyn operating in structures and contingencies, but they had found a livable rhythm, and Evelyn had genuinely wanted Isabella beside her on this day. She'd asked her to be maid of honor 6 months ago. Isabella had cried. Real tears, Evelyn had believed them. She would think about that later. She would think about it for a long time. At 9:40, the bridal suite was crowded and warm and running slightly behind schedule. The stylist was finishing Eleanor's hair. The event coordinator was in the doorway running through a timeline adjustment. Isabella was doing something on her phone in the corner armchair. Evelyn had clocked it but hadn't said anything, assuming it was logistics. The room smelled like hairspray and the peonies that had been arranged on every surface, and someone had put on instrumental music that Evelyn found faintly irritating but hadn't bothered to turn off. She needed air, not dramatic air, not I need a moment air. Just the quiet, practical oxygen of a woman who had been in a warm crowded room for 2 hours and needed 30 seconds of corridor silence before she could continue. She slipped out through the side door that connected the bridal suite to the East Wing service corridor. It was narrow and plain and smelled like cleaning product and old carpet, one of the utilitarian veins that ran through the estate's older section, used by staff and ignored by family. She'd played in corridors like this as a child, back when the estate was more chaos than order, and her father's world was still being built rather than inherited. She heard voices before she'd taken 4 steps. Not loud. Not conspiratorial in the theatrical sense. Just 2 people talking in the focused, efficient way that people talk when they believe they are completely alone and have things to confirm before a deadline. Dante's voice first. She recognized the particular flatness he got when he was thinking practically rather than socially, the voice he used in meetings, not the voice he used with her. The amendment goes into the filing system the moment the ceremony is concluded. Adrian won't see it until Monday at the earliest, and by then the notarization will be in order. She stopped walking, and if she reads the prenuptial more carefully tonight, Isabella's voice. Low, steady, not the voice of someone being coerced. She won't. She's reviewed it 3 times already. The succession clause is embedded in Section 14 under the pregnancy protection provisions. Her attorneys read it as standard next-of-kin language. It isn't. Evelyn stood very still. Her hand moved without her deciding to move it. Her grandmother's locket, the antique gold one she'd worn all morning. Inside it was not a photograph. Inside it was a miniature audio recorder, no larger than a matchstick, that she'd installed 2 years ago when a competitor had tried to plant a listening device in her office, and she decided she would never be the person in the room without documentation. She pressed the small recessed button on the locket's clasp, felt the faint vibration that confirmed it was running, and she listened. Dante spoke for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. She would know the exact duration later when Adrian played the file. In those 4 minutes and 20 seconds, she learned that the marriage amendment embedded in Section 14 of their prenuptial agreement contained language that would transfer voting authority over Morty family business decisions to Dante in the event that Evelyn was declared. medically incapable of managing her responsibilities. She learned that he had 2 doctors, one in New York, one in Hartford, who were prepared to provide written assessments citing pregnancy-related cognitive instability and emotional incapacitation. She learned that the plan was designed to move slowly enough that by the time anyone understood what had happened, Dante would already hold the controlling votes. She learned that her sister had known about this for at least 3 months. She learned that Isabella had provided Dante with the family's internal schedule, the security rotation, financial reporting timelines, and the name of the corporate attorney most likely to raise objections early so that attorney could be quietly sidelined before the documents were filed. She learned, at the very end, in a sentence that landed in her chest like something physical, that Dante's plan for the baby she was carrying was to use the child's legal status as a Cuso heir to create an additional claim against Morty family assets if Evelyn ever recovered enough to challenge his authority. Then Isabella said something that Evelyn hadn't expected. She said, "You told me I would be part of this. You told me once Evelyn was removed I would have a seat at the table." And Dante said, in a tone so gentle it was almost kind, "And you will. As long as you stay useful." The corridor was silent for a moment. Then the sound of footsteps moving away toward the main hall. Evelyn did not move for 30 seconds. She was 5 months pregnant. She was wearing her grandmother's wedding dress. She had 200 guests arriving in 90 minutes, including 3 federal judges, 2 state senators, the heads of 4 rival organized crime families, 7 Port Authority officials who operated in her family's orbit, and her mother, who had said at breakfast that her father would have liked him. She pressed her palm flat against the corridor wall, felt the plaster, felt the specific solidity of it. Old house, real walls, things her father had paid for. Her father had taught her one thing above everything else in the 17 years he'd spent grooming her to lead what he'd built. He'd said it in different ways at different times, but it always came back to the same sentence. The first person to lose control in a betrayal becomes its first victim. She had 30 seconds of completely unmanaged feeling. Fear, fury, grief not for the marriage. She understood with cold clarity that the marriage had never been real, but for the version of this morning she'd been carrying around for 6 months. The version where the dress was just a dress and her sister's tears were just tears. Then she put her hand back on her stomach, felt the small firm weight of her son, and thought, not today. She walked back toward the bridal suite. She did not run. Her breathing was even. Her face, when she pushed open the side door and stepped back into the warm, crowded rooms, smelling of peonies and hairspray, was exactly the face of a woman who had stepped out for 30 seconds of corridor air and was now returning to the pleasant chaos of her own wedding morning. "There she is," Isabella said from the armchair, looking up from her phone with a smile. "Here I am," Evelyn said. She crossed to the vanity and sat down. Looked at her own reflection. The woman looking back at her was composed. Dressed in ivory silk, locket at her throat, 5 months along and steady as the estate's foundation walls. She picked up her phone and opened a message thread to Adrian Cho. Adrian was 61, her family's lead corporate attorney, the man who had worked beside her father for 22 years, and who Evelyn trusted more than she trusted most people she shared blood with. She had not called him yet today because she had not needed to. Now she did. She typed, "I need you in the East Wing study in 20 minutes. Come alone. Tell no one." She set the phone face down on the vanity table. "You okay?" Eleanor asked from across the room. "You look pale." "I'm fine," Evelyn said, "just warm." She was not fine. But fine was a performance she had been giving since she was 19 years old, and she was very, very good at it. Adrian appeared in the East Wing study at 10:07. He was wearing his ceremony suit dark charcoal, the good one he brought out for Morty family occasions, and he had the particular alert stillness of a man who had received an unusual message and was prepared for whatever came next without having pre-decided what that meant. Evelyn closed the door behind him and said, "Without sitting down, I need you to listen to something." She opened the locket, connected the recorder to her phone via the small adapter. She kept in the emergency kit in her dressing bag, the same bag her father had taught her to pack, recorder, adapter, 2 encrypted drives, a copy of every operating document for the family's top 5 holding companies, and enough cash to get out of most situations before anyone could freeze accounts. She had packed it every day for 2 years, the way some people packed vitamins. The recording played. Adrian stood without moving for the full duration. When it finished, he was quiet for 12 seconds. She counted. Then he said, "Show me the prenuptial." She pulled the bound document from the dressing bag she had kept her copy, the original signed version, and handed it to him. He went to section 14 immediately. He read it twice. The second time, his expression changed in a way that she recognized, because she had seen it on her father's face, the particular look of a man who has found the mechanism inside a piece of language and understood exactly how it operates. "It's embedded in the pregnancy protection clause," he said. "The language about temporary incapacity designations in subsection 14C. It reads like standard next of kin protective language." It isn't. I know. The trigger threshold is low enough that 2 cooperative medical assessments would satisfy it. He looked up. He has doctors. 2. New York and Hartford. "How long have you known this?" 45 minutes. Adrian set the document down. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had nothing legal in it. Then he said, "Your father wrote a protocol. Internal betrayal scenarios. He called it Black Ledger. He gave me sealed instructions 18 months ago with explicit directions not to open them unless you contacted me with a specific phrase." Evelyn looked at him. The phrase, Adrian said, was, "I need you in the East Wing study. Come alone, tell no one." The room went very quiet. Evelyn sat down. Not because her legs gave out they didn't, but because the realization that her father had anticipated this, had built something in the dark to protect her, without ever telling her it was there, was the first thing in 45 minutes that had broken through her control. Not by much, but enough that she needed to sit. He knew, she said. Not a question. He suspected vulnerability in the succession structure. He didn't name names. Adrian reached into his interior jacket pocket and produced a sealed envelope. It was old, the paper slightly yellowed, the seal her father's personal wax stamp. "He told me the phrase would only come from you if the situation warranted it. He said you would know." She took the envelope. Did not open it yet. "What's in Black Ledger?" "An emergency succession protocol. It immediately secures all Morty family voting authority under a trust structure that requires 3 board consensus to modify. It simultaneously files an emergency protective amendment with our corporate registry that supersedes any pending prenuptial addenda." Adrian paused. "If we activate it before the ceremony concludes, Dante's succession mechanism becomes legally void before it ever attaches." "Before the ceremony concludes," she repeated. "It requires your signature and mine. And it requires witnesses." He looked at her steadily. 200 of them would do. Evelyn understood immediately what he was suggesting. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The sound system. The estate system runs through a central panel in the East Wing operations room. Your head of venue staff, Raymond, has full access. Raymond's been with the family for 9 years.
Yes.
She looked at the envelope in her hands. Then she looked at the window, the grounds below, the white chairs arranged in rows, the magnolia arch at the far end of the ceremonial lawn where Dante would be standing in 1 hour and 40 minutes, confident and prepared and completely unaware that the woman he had decided to discard had already started moving. "I'm going to walk down that aisle," she said. Adrian said nothing. "I'm going to stand at that altar. I'm going to let him say every word of those vows. And when it is my turn to speak," she stopped, breathed. "Every person in that ballroom is going to hear exactly who he is." Adrian held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need 90 minutes. "You have 87, she said. "Go." She stayed in the study alone for 4 minutes after he left. Long enough to open her father's envelope. Inside was a single index card in his handwriting, the cramped, leftward slanting script she had memorized over a lifetime of watching him sign documents and write notes and leave messages on her desk when she was learning the business in her early 20s. It read, "If you're reading this, you already know what to do. You've always known. I just wanted to make sure the machinery was in place. Trust Adrian. Trust the protocol. Do not trust silence." Dad, she folded the card, pressed it flat between her palms for 3 seconds. Put it in the dressing bag. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, checked the locket, and walked back toward the bridal suite to finish having her hair done. Back in the suite, Isabella had opened the champagne. She was pouring glasses for the stylist and the coordinator with the loose, generous energy of someone who was either celebrating genuinely or performing celebration very competently. Evelyn watched her sister hand a glass to Eleanor and lean in to say something that made their mother laugh. And she felt something slide through her that she didn't have a word for grief and fury, compressed into a single sensation. The feeling of seeing a person clearly for the first time and realizing the image you'd been carrying of them was a painting, not a photograph. Isabella had been her maid of honor, had cried real tears when asked, had helped choose the flowers, had sat beside her through prenuptial reviews and vendor meetings and the 1,000 small logistical decisions that a wedding of this scale required. And through all of it, the whole time she had been feeding Dante information. Family schedules, security rotations, the name of the attorney most likely to catch what was buried in Section 14. The name of Adrian Cho, which meant Dante had tried to sideline Adrian and failed, because Adrian was the kind of man who did not get sidelined easily, and because Evelyn had kept him close without fully understanding why until this morning. Isabella looked over and caught Evelyn's eye. She smiled. Evelyn smiled back. "Your turn," the stylist said, gesturing toward the vanity chair. "We're running a little behind." "That's fine," Evelyn said, sitting down. "We have time." The morning moved. The suite filled and thinned and filled again, the coordinator coming in with updates, her mother leaving to take her position with the family's receiving group, the stylist finishing and departing, vendors appearing at the door with questions that were quickly answered. Evelyn moved through all of it with the surface composure of a woman managing a large event on her own wedding day, which was a performance that required almost no additional effort because it looked exactly like what she was actually doing. At 11:20, Raymond, the head of venue staff, appeared briefly in the doorway. He was a compact, quiet man in his mid-50s who had run events at the estate for nearly a decade. He caught Evelyn's eye over Isabella's head. He gave a single small nod. The sound system was ready. At 11:43, the guests were seated. Through the window, she could see the white chairs filled with 200 people who had come today believing they were attending a wedding. Politicians, bankers, federal judges whose chambers processed cases that touched Morty family business. The heads of rival families who had come partly out of respect and partly to take the measure of whatever alliance this marriage represented. Corporate executives, Port Authority officials, old friends. Old enemies in borrowed courtesy. Her family's world compressed into a lawn on a Connecticut estate on a cloudless autumn morning. Dante stood beneath the magnolia arch at the far end. Even from the window, even at this distance, she could read his posture. Settled, satisfied. The posture of a man who believes the outcome is already decided. At 11:52, Uncle Marcus appeared at the bridal suite door to escort Evelyn to the ceremony. He was 63, her father's older brother. The man who had helped raise her after her father's health began declining, a large, slow-moving, silver-haired man whose authority in the family was second only to hers and who she had trusted without examination for as long as she could remember. He looked at her with the particular gentle pride of a man who loved the girl she had been and was proud of the woman he believed he was seeing. She thought about Dante's voice in the corridor. "Someone inside the Morty family invited me into the game." He hadn't said Marcus's name, not on the recording. But he'd said someone. And the list of people with enough access to make Dante's operation possible was not a long one. She filed it. She did not act on it. "Not yet." "Ready?" Marcus said. "Almost," she said. She picked up her bouquet white roses and eucalyptus, which she had chosen herself 6 weeks ago, when she still believed the morning would be simple. She looked at Isabella. "Walk ahead. Give me 1 minute." Isabella went. Marcus waited in the hall. Evelyn stood alone in the bridal suite for 60 seconds, looking at nothing in particular, letting the last 60 seconds of who she had been before that corridor simply exist before she walked through the door into what came next. She thought about her son, the weight of him. The fact that he had no name yet because she and Dante had agreed to decide together after the birth. She would decide alone. That was fine. She had always been better at decisions she made alone. She picked up her grandmother's locket, turned it over once in her palm. Then she walked out. The processional began. The quartet started something classical and stately that the event coordinator had suggested, and Evelyn had approved without strong feelings either way. The 200 guests rose. Cameras lifted. Marcus offered his arm and she took it, and they began the walk down the center aisle between the white chairs, past the faces of people who believed this was the beginning of something. She walked steadily. She did not look at the faces clearly, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she was tracking other things. Raymond's position near the estate's east entrance where the sound panel connections ran. Adrian in the third row aisle seat, which he had specifically requested when the seating chart was finalized 2 weeks ago. His jacket was buttoned. His hands were folded. His expression was the practiced neutrality of a man who had been preparing something for 87 minutes and was ready. Dante watched her come. He was smiling. The genuine version she recognized it from 18 months of learning his face. Not performed. He really was pleased. Maybe he had even convinced himself that some portion of what he felt for her was real. She thought it was possible. She had known men who could hold genuine affection and calculated treachery in the same hand without experiencing any friction between them. She reached the arch, took her place across from him, felt his hands take hers. "You look," he said quietly, meant only for her, incredible. "Thank you," she said. The officiant began. The words moved through the air, the familiar architecture of ceremony, love and commitment, and the future arranged in formal language. She heard it the way you hear ambient sound in a room where you're concentrating on something else. She watched Dante's face, the confidence there, the completion. The expression of a man who has maneuvered a complex situation to its intended conclusion and is now simply present for the formality of the finale. Then it was his turn for vows. He spoke for 3 minutes. He talked about loyalty, about family, about the particular kind of love that didn't require performance because it was simply the condition of one person's life around another. He talked about protection and partnership and the future they were building. He talked about her strength, named it specifically, said he had never admired anyone more. He was word perfect. She listened to every sentence. When he finished, the officiant turned to her. "Evelyn," he said, "do you have vows to share?" She looked at Dante for a moment. His hands were still holding hers. His eyes were steady and warm. He was waiting for her to say yes, and then a few more words, and then it would be done, and the mechanism would close, and the rest would be logistics. She said, "I do want to say something. But before I make any promises to anyone in this place, I want to make sure everyone here has the full picture." Dante's expression shifted. A flicker, gone immediately, replaced by a mild, curious smile. "What do you mean?" she said, at a volume pitched slightly louder than conversational Raymond. The quartet stopped. Every one of 200 guests felt the wrongness of it. Before they understood it, the sudden silence, landing like a drop-dead weight, the sense of a script departing from itself. And then the estate's sound system activated. Dante's voice filled the air. "The amendment goes into the filing system the moment the ceremony is concluded. Adrian won't see it until Monday at the earliest, and by then the notarization will be in order." She felt his hands go rigid around hers. The succession clause is embedded in Section 14 under the pregnancy protection provisions. Her attorneys read it as standard next-of-kin language. It isn't. His face, in this moment, was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Not because it satisfied her, it didn't. Not in the way she'd imagined satisfaction might feel. But because it was the first, completely true expression she had ever seen from him. Stripped of calculation. Just a man understanding that he had lost something, and not yet knowing how much. Once the documents are signed, she won't be able to challenge anything. "The doctors I have on retainer will certify the instability within 72 hours. Her pregnancy makes it cleaner. Nobody questions a woman who can't cope." The 200 guests were absolutely still. Then Isabella's voice came through the speakers. "You told me I would be part of this. You told me once Evelyn was removed I would have a seat at the table. And Dante's answer, and you will, as long as you stay useful." The recording ended. Not a single person in that ballroom moved. Evelyn looked at her sister in the front row. Isabella had gone the color of the white tablecloths. Her champagne glass was still in her hand. She was looking at Evelyn with an expression that was hard to categorize, not innocence, because that was gone, but something adjacent to shock, as if some part of her had genuinely not believed Evelyn would do this, or genuinely not believed Dante would sound like that when played back in daylight. Dante released her hands. He said, voice low and controlled, with the specific tone of a man trying to recapture a room through sheer force of steadiness, "That recording is doctored. Whoever prepared this has the amendment," Evelyn said. Adrian was already standing. He produced a document, a copy, the signed and notarized original, now secured with the emergency succession protocol filing, and carried it forward. He addressed the room, not Dante. in the clear, deliberate voice of a man who had been a corporate attorney for 35 years and knew how to hold a room. What you heard is authentic. This document, a copy of the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties, contains language in Section 14, subsection C, that does not function as pregnancy protection. It functions as a succession transfer mechanism designed to vest voting authority over Morty family business entities in Dante Cuso upon a medical incapacity determination. The threshold for that determination has been calibrated to be achievable through cooperative medical assessments that Mr. Cuso had already arranged. He let that sit for 3 seconds. Additionally, as of 40 minutes ago, the Morty family's emergency succession protocol has been filed and notarized, rendering any pending prenuptial amendment legally void under existing corporate charter protections. Dante was very still. Around him, the 200 guests, the politicians and bankers and judges and rival family heads and port officials and old enemies in borrowed courtesy, were beginning to understand that they had not come to a wedding. They had come to watch a coup collapse in front of them. And the woman in the ivory dress, 5 months pregnant with her grandmother's locket at her throat, had already won. This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely fictional and invented. The silence after Adrian finished speaking lasted exactly 4 seconds. Evelyn counted them. Then the ballroom broke. Not loudly, not the way a crowd breaks at a sporting event or a street altercation. It broke the way expensive rooms break, with murmuring and the scrape of chair legs and the particular sound of 200 powerful people recalibrating simultaneously. The federal judges leaned toward one another. The port authority officials exchanged looks that contained entire conversations. The rival family heads, 3 of them seated in the 5th and 6th rows, men who had come today partly as a courtesy and partly to take the measure of what a Morty Cuso alliance would mean. For the northeastern landscape went very still in the specific way that dangerous men go still when they are deciding whether a situation is an opportunity or a liability. Dante had not moved from his position beneath the magnolia arch. That was the thing Evelyn noticed first, in the seconds after Adrian sat back down. Dante had not stepped back or forward or sideways. He was standing exactly where he'd been standing when the recording started, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen from him before, not anger, not the cold calculation she now understood had been running beneath everything, but something that looked uncomfortably like assessment. Like he was still doing math. Like even now, in front of 200 people, some part of his mind was running through options. That frightened her more than anger would have. She held his gaze. He said, quietly enough that the front rows couldn't quite catch it, "You have no idea what you've just done." "I have a very specific idea," she said. Not to me, his voice was completely flat. "To yourself." Before she could answer, Marcus moved. He came from the family section, the chairs arranged to the left of the aisle, where the Morty family had been seated, and he moved with the particular urgency of a large man trying to reach a situation before it becomes something he can't contain. He put himself physically between Evelyn and Dante, which was either protective or strategic, and she wasn't certain which yet. He turned to face the room, both hands raised slightly, and said in the carrying voice he'd developed over 40 years of being the Morty family's public-facing authority figure, "Everyone, please." "We need a moment to sit down, Marcus," Evelyn said. He turned, looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't expected, not guilt, not yet, but a particular quality of flinching that she recognized now as the expression of a man who knows more than he's supposed to and has known it for long enough that it started to show. "Evelyn, sit down," he sat. Dante watched this exchange with the careful attention of a man filing information. Then he turned to the room and did something she had not anticipated. He addressed it directly, in the clear, authoritative voice he used in boardrooms, the voice that projected absolute confidence in the legitimacy of what he was saying. "What you've just heard," he said, "is a recording that has been selectively edited to construct a narrative. The succession provisions in our prenuptial agreement were designed to protect Evelyn's interests and our child's interests in the event of a genuine medical incapacity. That's standard legal practice in estates of this complexity. What you're watching is a misunderstanding that's been weaponized by people who have interests in preventing this marriage." He let that land, looked around the room with practiced calm. "I would like to speak with my fiancé privately." This is a family matter, and it deserves to be resolved. The recording hasn't been edited, Adrian said from his seat. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He just said it the way you say something that doesn't require performance to be true. I can provide chain of custody documentation for the audio file. The Lockett recorder's timestamp matches the estate's internal security log from this morning at 9:51. If anyone in this room would like to review the technical authentication, I'll make it available. 3 of the federal judges exchanged looks. One of them a woman in her 60s, gray-haired and wearing a navy jacket, whom Evelyn recognized as Judge Patricia Halloran from the Second Circuit said, at a volume that carried clearly, "I'd like to see that documentation." Dante looked at her. Halloran looked back. It was the moment the room shifted from witnessing to participating. Evelyn said, "Adrian, please provide Judge Halloran with the authentication file." Then she turned to the room and said, with the directness her father had modeled for her since childhood, "I want to be clear about something. What you heard is real. The amendment is real. The doctors he has under retainer are real. I'm not asking anyone here to take an action or make a judgment. I'm asking you to understand what this marriage was designed to accomplish and why it cannot proceed." She paused. "My family's succession protocol has been filed. Our corporate charter is protected. This is finished." This, Dante said with a quiet weight that didn't reach the room but absolutely reached her, is not finished. He walked, not out, not in retreat, which she understood would have cost him something in front of these people. He walked to the right toward the estate's interior entrance, the glass-paneled doors that led from the ceremonial lawn into the main hall. 2 members of his own security detail fell into step behind him. Her head of estate security, a former federal marshal named Cole, who had worked for her father for 11 years, moved to intercept. Dante stopped, looked at Cole. Cole was not physically intimidating by size, but he had the particular stillness of a man who has made difficult decisions in difficult situations, and found the experience clarifying rather than disturbing. He said without any particular inflection, "Mr. Cuso, Ms. Morty has requested that you remain on the property while some matters are reviewed." Dante's security team shifted. Cole's 2 associates materialized from the estate's perimeter positions. The standoff lasted 6 seconds. Then Dante, with the composure of a man who knew that physical confrontation in front of federal judges and rival crime family heads would cost him more than compliance, said, "Fine." He said it to Cole, not to Evelyn. She took note of that. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos, in the way that expensive events in crisis are always controlled chaos, the surface maintaining some semblance of order, while underneath, everything was moving fast and in multiple directions simultaneously. The event coordinator materialized at Evelyn's elbow with the terrified efficiency of a woman who had managed large events for 20 years and had never encountered one that collapsed into an evidentiary proceeding, and Evelyn told her quietly to have the catering staff begin serving lunch in the main hall, because 200 people who had just witnessed what they'd witnessed needed something to do with their hands and their nervous systems. And food was the most civilized option available. Most of the guests moved. Some didn't. The 3 rival family heads, Carmine Sessa, Vincent Lau, and a man everyone called Breckenridge, who had no first name in common circulation, stayed in their seats and waited. She'd known they would. Events like this were information events for men like them, and information was never wasted. Judge Halloran stayed and examined Adrian's documentation with the focused precision of a woman who had spent 30 years separating authentic evidence from manufactured narrative. Isabella had not moved at all. She was still in the front row, in the seat she'd occupied as maid of honor, and the champagne glass was still in her hand, though at some point in the preceding minutes she had set it on the small table beside her chair without apparently noticing she'd done it. She was looking at the magnolia arch, at nothing. At whatever people look at when they're trying to locate the moment where everything went wrong and can't quite find it, because it turns out the moment was a long time ago and they'd been walking toward it. For so long they'd stopped being able to see it coming. Evelyn sat in the chair that someone, the coordinator, probably had quietly placed beside her. Her feet hurt. The dress was heavy. She was 5 months pregnant and had been managing an acute crisis for 3 hours on top of a morning that had begun at 5:45, and her body was beginning to register all of that information simultaneously. She sat and she breathed and watched her sister not move. Then she got up and walked to the front row. She sat in the empty chair beside Isabella. Isabella didn't look at her. How long? Evelyn said. Silence for 4 seconds. 8 months, Isabella said. 8 months. The calculation landed with a kind of mechanical precision. 8 months ago, Dante had still been in what Evelyn would have described as the courtship phase, the part where they were still figuring out what they were to each other. Before the engagement, before any discussion of what a marriage would mean for the family's legal structures. 8 months ago, he had already been talking to her sister. How did he approach you? Isabella finally turned. Her eyes were dry, which was somehow worse than tears would have been. He didn't approach me. I approached him. Evelyn hadn't expected that. I knew about you and him before you told the family, Isabella said. I saw you together at the Providence dinner in February. I reached out to him separately. I told him I thought you were moving too fast. I told him I had concerns about what a marriage of this scale would mean for the family's governance. She stopped. Started again. He listened very well. He asked intelligent questions. He made me feel like I was being taken seriously. And then, over the next few weeks, he started sharing things with me about what he actually intended, about the succession structure. He framed it as he called it a protective arrangement. He said you were taking on too much and that someone needed to make sure the family's interests were secured if your health became a concern during the pregnancy. Isabella's voice was flat, factual, like she was reading from something. He said he wanted me involved, that once the transition happened, he would bring me in as a genuine partner in managing the family's affairs. He said you and I had never that our relationship had always been. She stopped. Say it, Evelyn said. He said you'd always treated me like a liability instead of an asset. That you ran everything like our father taught you, and there was no room for anyone who did things differently. Isabella looked at her. And I knew he was using me. I'm not stupid. But I also believed there was something real there. Between him and me, not just strategy, the cruelty of it was specific and exact. Dante had found Isabella's actual wound the real one, the one that Evelyn was not entirely innocent of, and had pressed on it with precision. The distance between the sisters was real. The dynamic where Evelyn ran things and Isabella existed in her orbit without real authority or genuine consultation that was real too. He hadn't invented the fracture. He'd just widened it and walked through. He told you, Evelyn said carefully, that once I was removed, you'd have a seat at the table. Yes. And you believed him. I believed him for about 5 months. Isabella's jaw tightened. And then the recording you just played that was made this morning. It was. He said to my face 2 weeks ago that he genuinely cared about what happened to me, that the arrangement was mutually beneficial. She laughed, which was not a pleasant sound. And you will as long as you stay useful. Yes. When did you know about me specifically? Isabella asked. When did you know I was involved? This morning. Corridor everything. Isabella absorbed this. You walked back into the suite and smiled at me. Yes. For 2 hours. Yes. Isabella looked at her for a moment with an expression that combined shame and something that was almost, despite everything, reluctant admiration. I keep thinking about Dad, she said quietly. What he would say. I know what he'd say. He'd say I got played. He'd say you let the wrong person tell you the right story. Isabella looked down at her hands. I'm sorry, Evelyn. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The sorry was real. She could tell the difference between performance and the genuine article. And this was the genuine article, which didn't make it simple or sufficient, but made it something she would have to figure out what to do with, eventually. I know, she said. We'll deal with that later. She stood because there were other things moving, and she could only sit still for so long before the machinery started running without her. Dante had been placed in the estate's east sitting room under Cole's supervision. 2 of his security team were with him. Her team occupied the room's perimeter. The arrangement was more agreement than detention. He was Dante Cuso, not someone you physically restrained without consequences that would follow the family long after this morning, but it was also not optional, and everyone in that room understood it. Evelyn walked in. Cole acknowledged her with a slight nod and positioned himself near the door. Dante was seated in one of the leather chairs near the window, jacket still pristine, tie still straight, looking for all the world like a man who had sat down for a brief pause in a long day, rather than a man whose carefully constructed plan had just been detonated in front of 200 witnesses. She sat across from him. You want to tell me, she said, who inside my family brought you in? He looked at her with the steady, patient expression of someone prepared to wait out a line of questioning. Dante, you're very good at this, he said. Your father trained you well. He did. Who brought you in? I came in on my own. The opportunity presented itself. That's not what you said in the corridor this morning. You said the conspiracy began long before you met me. You said someone inside the family invited you into the game. A slight pause. I was speaking loosely. You don't speak loosely. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted just slightly, just enough. Marcus has been frustrated with the direction of the family's operations for years. He believes you've been too conservative, too cautious. He thinks Leonard stopped. He thinks your father built something that required more aggression than you were willing to bring. Marcus came to you. Marcus opened a conversation. That's different, is it? He didn't know what I intended. He thought he was bringing in a useful external pressure point, a counterweight to what he perceived as your excessive caution. Dante's voice was completely calm. He's been talking to me for 3 years, long before you and I were in the same room. 3 years. The number restructured her understanding of the last 18 months completely. Dante hadn't arrived in her world by accident. He hadn't been introduced at a conference by chance. He had been positioned, maneuvered into proximity by her own uncle over 3 years, operating under the belief that he was managing the introduction for the family's benefit, while Dante was running a completely different calculation. She kept her face still. What exactly did Marcus share with you? Financial reporting, governance structure, internal disagreements about succession planning, the general shape of the family's vulnerabilities. He paused. And the information that Leonard had written a Black Ledger protocol, but that you didn't know what it was or that it existed. She felt the cold of that move through her. He'd known about Black Ledger before she did. He'd planned around it, which meant his succession mechanism had been designed to move fast enough to outrun it, to file before she could activate it, to make the amendment legally precedent before the protocol could void it. Her margin this morning had not been as wide as she'd felt it was in the East Wing study. It had been very, very thin. Why are you telling me this, she said. Because you'll find it out anyway, Dante said. And because I want you to understand something before you decide what comes next. What would that be? He leaned forward slightly. Not threatening, just shifting the register from formal to something that felt uncomfortably like honesty. What I did was real. The method was wrong. The mechanism was wrong. I understand that clearly. But the core of it, the belief that the Morty Empire requires more aggressive leadership, more willingness to act, more structural integration with networks that your father spent his last years pulling away from that belief, is not mine alone. Marcus shares it, and there are others. Others, she repeated. People inside your organization, not traitors. People who believe the family is vulnerable in ways you haven't fully acknowledged and who think the solution isn't more caution. She stood. You tried to take everything I have and everything my son will have. I tried to build something larger than what either of us had separately. By manufacturing medical evidence to have me declared incapacitated. He was quiet for a second. The method was wrong. Yes, she said it was. She walked to the door. Then she stopped without turning. Cole is going to need you to surrender your phone and your security team's communications equipment. If you cooperate with that, today stays manageable. If you don't, I'll have Judge Halleckern in this room within 10 minutes, and we'll have a different kind of conversation. Silence then. Fine. She walked out. Marcus was in the main hall, standing near the windows that overlooked the back gardens, apart from the guests who were moving through the catering setup, with the stunned, careful energy of people at an event that had become something none of them had prepared for. He was holding a glass of water he hadn't drunk. He was looking at the gardens. She came and stood beside him. Not in front of him, beside him, the way they'd stood together at her father's funeral. He told me, she said. Marcus turned. His face was gray in a way that had nothing to do with the light. Evelyn, I need you to tell me everything, all of it. From the beginning. He looked at her for a long time. The particular look of a man who has been carrying something heavy for years and has finally arrived at the moment where setting it down is no longer a choice, but an inevitability. It started, Marcus said slowly, 3.5 years ago. He talked for 22 minutes. She didn't interrupt. The shape of it as it came out was almost sadder than the betrayal. Marcus had not approached Dante with a plan for a coup. He had approached Dante had initiated contact through a mutual associate in the New York shipping network because he was genuinely worried about the family, not about Evelyn's competence. He'd been clear about that, careful about that, his voice carrying the specific precision of a man who needed her to understand the distinction. He had never doubted her capability. He had doubted the direction. He had watched Leonard, in his final years, begin pulling the family away from certain networks, certain arrangements, the older and more aggressive alliances that had made the empire possible in the first place. And he had believed, still believed. She could hear it that this retreat was a strategic mistake, that the family was becoming too legitimate, too fast, and that legitimacy without the underlying teeth left you exposed. He had brought Dante in as what he thought was a counterweight. A conversation, an external voice that might shift her thinking. I didn't know what he intended, Marcus said, not at first. When did you figure it out? He was quiet, Marcus. 4 months ago, he said. I saw a draft of the amendment. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough to know it was more aggressive than I'd authorized. 4 months ago, and you didn't tell me. I confronted Dante. He told me the mechanism was a precaution, not a plan. He told me it would never be activated without my knowledge. He told me he needed my continued cooperation to protect what we'd built together. Marcus's voice was very quiet. And I was already in it. I had already given him information. I had already made introductions. If I had come to you 4 months ago, I would have had to explain all of it. So you said nothing. I said nothing. She stood with that for a moment. The wind came off the gardens, warm and carrying the smell of the floral arrangements, which were still standing, which struck her as absurd given everything. I'm going to need you to give Adrian everything, she said. Every communication, every introduction, every document you saw or touched. All of it. Yes. And I need to know, she said, whether there's anyone else inside the organization. Anyone he was working with that you know of, beyond what you provided. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, there's a financial officer at the Providence terminal. His name is Garrett Sims. He's been with the family for 6 years. Dante approached him approximately 8 months ago. I believe he's been providing shipping schedule data. She hadn't known that name, which meant there was at least one more layer she hadn't found yet, which meant the structure of what Dante had built inside her organization was deeper than even the recording had revealed. She walked away from Marcus without another word, because there was nothing else to say to him right now that wouldn't be either cruelty or false comfort, and she didn't have room for either. She found Adrian at the table near the east entrance, where he'd set up a temporary workspace laptop, documents, phone with the systematic efficiency of a man who had been waiting 30 years for a situation worthy of his preparation. She told him about Garrett Sims. She watched him write the name down. How deep does it go, she said. Based on what Marcus provided and what Dante's records will show once we access them. And the phone surrender is going to be key. I think we're looking at a 3-year penetration of the family's operational information. Shipping schedules, governance timelines, financial reporting cycles. He paused. Nothing that compromises the core holding structures. He didn't have enough access for that, but enough to know where you were vulnerable and how to time an approach. The succession mechanism was designed to move before Black Ledger could void it. Yes. He knew the protocol existed. He built a filing timeline around it. Adrian looked at her. We beat him by 40 minutes, Evelyn. 40 minutes. She felt the weight of that number. Your father, Adrian said carefully, left one more thing in the sealed instructions. What? A note about the vault. She looked at him. His private vault, in the basement. He left instructions that said, and I'm quoting, if Black Ledger is ever activated, the people who need to understand why are the ones who should be in the vault tonight. Adrian paused. He listed names. Yumi, Marcus, Isabella. He paused again. And your mother. Outside, through the glass panel doors, she could see that the ceremonial lawn was mostly empty now, the guests having moved inside to the main hall, where the catering staff was maintaining the strange pretense of a reception for an event that had never technically concluded. The magnolia arch was still standing, still decorated, the white ribbons moving slightly in the afternoon wind. Dante's voice came through the glass doors before she saw him. Cole had evidently permitted a supervised movement because Dante was standing on the lawn, flanked by 2 estate security personnel, looking at the arch. He was not moving toward it. He was just standing there, looking at the thing he'd stood beneath 90 minutes ago, believing the day was already decided. He looked over, found her through the glass. She held his gaze. He said something she couldn't hear through the glass. Might have been her name. Might have been something else. She turned away. She walked toward the main hall, where 173 guests were eating catered food in the polite, shell-shocked silence of people who had witnessed something they would be explaining for years and weren't sure yet what the correct way to feel about it was. She moved through the room without stopping, making eye contact with the people who mattered most. Judge Halloran, who gave her a slight nod, Carmine Sessa, who tilted his head in a small gesture of acknowledgement that she understood as respect from a man who didn't offer it easily, her mother, Eleanor, who was seated at the family table with the rigid posture of a woman managing profound shock through the application of absolute dignity. Evelyn sat beside her mother. Eleanor reached across and held her hand. Did not speak. They sat like that for 40 seconds. Then Eleanor said, very quietly, "Your father would not have let you face this alone." "He didn't," Evelyn said. "He just arranged it so I wouldn't know he was helping until I needed it." Eleanor absorbed this. Her grip on Evelyn's hand tightened slightly. "The vault," she said. Evelyn looked at her. "He told me about it," Eleanor said. "Years ago. He said if the day ever came that I needed to go into the vault, I would know why." She paused. "I always assumed it would be after he was gone." "It is after he's gone." "Yes." Eleanor's voice was very steady. "Yes, I suppose it is." Isabella peered at the table's edge. She stood there, not sitting, not leaving. Not sure which was permitted. She looked at Eleanor, then at Evelyn, with the expression of a woman who is trying to determine whether she is still family or has exited that category permanently and is now something more complicated. Evelyn looked up at her. "Sit down," she said. Isabella sat. 3 of them at the table. The sounds of the room around them, the murmur of voices, the careful movement of catering staff, the distant sound of Cole's team, somewhere in the estate, managing the particular logistics of a crisis that had not yet fully resolved itself. From the east entrance, Adrian appeared. He crossed to the table, leaned down, and said quietly, close to Evelyn's ear, "We have a problem." She turned. "Dante's phone," Adrian said. "Cole's team got it. Our technical consultant is reviewing it now." He paused. "There's an outgoing message sent at 11:58 this morning, 3 minutes before the ceremony started. 11:58. When she was at the window, when she was watching Dante at the arch from the bridal suite, reading his posture, believing she had already won. Who was it sent to, she said. Adrian's expression was the expression of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have. "Dr. Warren Keel," he said. "Hartford." "The physician on retainer," he paused. The message said, "Initiate the filing regardless of today's outcome. Use the backup document. She won't find it in time." Evelyn was very still. "There's a second amendment," Adrian said quietly. "Not the one in the prenuptial. A separate document. Already in the filing queue at the state corporate registry. Scheduled to process Monday morning." He looked at her with the careful steadiness of a man who needs her to hear the next sentence clearly. "If we don't intercept it before Monday, it attaches to the existing corporate structure independent of the prenuptial. Black Ledger voids the prenuptial mechanism. It doesn't void a standalone filing." She sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked at Adrian and said, "How long do we have?" "The registry closes at 5 today. It's 2:17. She stood. "Call Judge Halloran," she said. "This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely fictional and invented. Judge Patricia Halloran was not a woman who moved fast as a rule. She moved deliberately. She moved with the particular economy of someone who had spent 30 years in courtrooms understanding that speed without precision was just expensive noise. But when Evelyn crossed the main hall toward her table and said, quietly and directly, "I need 2 minutes of your time, and then I'm going to need you to make a phone call," Halloran set down her water glass and stood up in one motion, and the two of them walked to the east corridor without another word exchanged. Adrian laid it out in 90 seconds. The Second Amendment. The standalone filing. The Monday processing window. The message from Dante's phone at 11:58. Halloran listened without interrupting. When Adrian finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "You have the phone in your possession. Chain of custody intact?" Cole's team logged it at 12:41. No breaks. Halloran looked at Evelyn. If the filing process is Monday morning, it attaches to the corporate structure independently of the prenuptial. That's our reading, Adrian said. The language is designed to operate as a standalone instrument. Black Ledger voids the prenuptial mechanism. It doesn't reach a separate corporate filing. Who's the registry contact? Deputy Director Louise Farron. Second Circuit Commercial Division. Halloran's expression didn't change. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced her phone. I've known Louise Farron for 19 years. She looked at the time. You have a 2-hour, 43-minute window. Give me the filing reference number. Adrian produced it from his laptop, a 12-digit registry code that Dante's technical consultant had found embedded in the message thread, formatted as a confirmation number for a pending submission. Halloran took the number, walked 6 steps further down the corridor for privacy, and made the call. Evelyn stood still. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. The dress felt heavier than it had an hour ago. The locket was warm against her sternum. Through the walls, she could hear the muted sound of the main hall, 200 people managing the aftermath of a morning that none of them had prepared for, and the sound was oddly comforting. The way ambient noise is comforting when you're the only person in a room who knows how bad it almost got. Adrian said, without looking up from his laptop, she'll get it frozen. You don't know that. Has never lost a phone call she decided to win. He paused. Your father knew that too. Why do you think he put her on the guest list? Evelyn turned and looked at him. The seating chart for today, Adrian said carefully, was finalized 6 months ago, before you and Dante made the final venue decisions. I submitted the preliminary guest list to the estate coordinator based on family relationships and professional associations. He paused again. Judge Halloran was on that list before Dante's people reviewed it. I didn't add her. She was already there. Dad's list, Evelyn said. Leonard gave me a sealed addendum to the Black Ledger instructions 14 months ago. It contained 12 names, people he wanted present if Black Ledger was ever activated. He looked at her steadily. Halloran was one of them. So were 2 of the Port Authority officials in the main hall. And Carmine Sessa. She absorbed this in silence. Her father had not just built a protocol. He had built a witness list. He had understood years before his death that if betrayal ever came from inside the family, the response couldn't be private. It had to be witnessed by people whose presence made the record permanent and whose authority made the outcome uncontestable. He had spent the last years of his life quietly, carefully setting a table for a dinner he hoped would never be necessary. She thought about the index card in the dressing bag. I just wanted to make sure the machinery was in place. Halloran came back. Her expression was the careful neutral of a woman delivering news she's verified before speaking. The filing has been flagged for administrative review, pending authentication of the submitting party's authorization credentials. It will not process Monday. Louise is pulling the submission into a holding status that requires a court order to release. She paused. I've also asked her to document the timestamp and content of the flag for evidentiary purposes. Thank you, Evelyn said. Don't thank me yet. Halloran looked at her directly. If there are 2 amendments, there may be more instruments in the filing system you don't know about. I'd recommend a comprehensive audit of every pending submission touching Morty family corporate entities going back 18 months. Evelyn looked at Adrian. I'll start tonight, he said. Growth. She nodded. Then she walked back toward the main hall because there was still a room full of people out there, and because Dante was still on her property, and because the morning was not finished, not even close. And the one thing she had learned from her father about managing complex situations was that the moment you believe it's contained is usually the moment the next layer opens. It opened faster than she expected. She was halfway across the main hall when Cole appeared from the interior corridor, at a pace she recognized immediately as controlled urgency, the specific speed of a man who is moving fast without running, because running would cause. Panic was the last thing this room needed. He reached her, positioned himself close, and said very quietly, Isabella. She stopped. She's gone, Cole said. Evelyn looked at him. She was at the family table 10 minutes ago. One of my team saw her stand up and walk toward the bathroom corridor. She didn't come back. He paused. Her phone is off. Her car is still in the guest lot, but the east service gate logged an exit at 2:29. A vehicle we don't have registered to the property. 2:29, 11 minutes ago. Who picked her up? We're running the gate footage now. Evelyn's mind moved fast through the architecture of the morning. Isabella at the family table, contrite, saying she was sorry, saying she knew she'd been played, saying she understood what she'd done. And then a phone call, a message, something that came in and changed the calculation, made staying more dangerous than leaving. Or something that had been planned before the morning started, a contingency Dante had built in for the possibility that Isabella's cover was blown, a signal that went out and pulled her before she could be questioned formally. "Get me the footage," she said. Cole had it within 4 minutes. They reviewed it on his tablet in the corridor, outside the main hall, grainy, but clear enough. The East certificate at 2:27. Isabella walking quickly in the ceremony dress she hadn't had time to change out of. A dark SUV with no visible plates waiting 20 meters past the gate. She got in. The vehicle moved east toward the coastal road. The driver's face was not visible. "Pull every camera on the coastal road for the next 6 miles, Evelyn said. Already requested. She handed back the tablet, stewed in the corridor for a moment, processing the specific shape of what had just happened. Isabella leaving was not, on its face, catastrophic. Her testimony would have been useful. The recording was already authenticated. The amendment was already documented. The black ledger filing was already complete. Isabella's cooperation would have made the subsequent investigation cleaner, but was not essential to the core evidentiary structure. What frightened her was not that Isabella had left. It was that someone had sent a vehicle. Someone who knew which gate. Someone who knew the timing. Someone who had been monitoring the situation in real time and had moved a resource into position within 2 hours of the ceremony collapsing. That required organization. It required someone outside the estate who was following developments closely enough to execute a contingency that fast. She walked back toward the east sitting room. Dante was in the same chair. Cole's team was in the same positions. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted just slightly, just enough to tell her that he already knew. "Where did the vehicle come from?" she said. He looked at her without answering. "Isabella is gone. Someone picked her up from the east service gate 20 minutes ago. The vehicle was pre-positioned." She walked closer. "You sent a message at 11:58 to Keel. Initiate the filing regardless of today's outcome. Use the backup document." "Was there another message? A different recipient?" Silence. "Was it the same person who positioned the vehicle, or was that Marcus?" Dante said Marcus didn't know about the vehicle. She hadn't expected him to confirm that. Who did? He leaned forward slightly, the same posture he'd used earlier, not threatening, just shifting into a different register. "Evelyn, I want to be honest with you about something. You're about 47 years late for that, but go ahead. Isabella is not in danger. The vehicle was a precaution. If today went wrong, she needed a way out before she could be questioned formally. That's protection, not harm. Protection," she repeated. "She knows things that, in the wrong hands, could create problems for people who weren't involved in this directly. Getting her out before a formal proceeding starts keeps the blast radius contained. Who are the people she could create problems for?" He was quiet, Dante. She sat down across from him. She was very tired, and she let him see that, because she had learned from her father that sometimes the most effective interrogation was not pressure, but honesty, showing the other person that you are real and exhausted and willing to sit here for as long as it takes. "The filing is frozen. The amendment is void. The recording is authenticated. You have nothing left to protect. The people you're covering for right now are not going to cover for you. Tell me who she could create problems for, and tell me where the vehicle is taking her." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a man named Gerald Fitch." She didn't recognize the name. He operates a private equity vehicle out of Boston. Legitimate on the surface as commercial estate, infrastructure investment. He has been a silent financial backer of my New York operations for 11 years. Dante's voice was careful, measured. He is also, through a series of layered holding structures, a minority stakeholder in 2 of your family's port facility operating companies. The cold of that was immediate and specific. "He's inside our structure," she said. "He's been for 4 years, before I was involved. He found the entry point through a secondary acquisition your father approved without knowing Fitch was the beneficial owner behind the acquiring vehicle." Dante paused. "Your father found out approximately 8 months before he died. He began the process of identifying the full extent of Fitch's position. He hadn't completed it when he became ill, 8 months before her father died. Which meant her father had spent the last 8 months of his life quietly trying to map an infiltration he hadn't told her about, hadn't told Marcus about, hadn't told anyone about, because by that point he already understood that the infiltration might extend to people he trusted inside the family, and the only safe approach was to work alone. The vault, tonight. Her father had known about Fitch, and whatever he'd found, whatever he'd documented, was in that vault. Isabella knows about Fitch, Evelyn said. That's why you moved her. She knows his name, she knows he exists, she knows he was backing the succession plan. Dante held her gaze. If she talks to investigators before Fitch's people can manage the exposure, it creates a problem for him that he will solve in the way men like Fitch solve problems. The implication landed like something dropped from a height. She's not being protected, Evelyn said. She's being contained. He didn't answer, which was an answer. She stood up. Cole. Cole was at the door immediately. I need Isabella found in the next hour. Coastal road cameras, marina surveillance, every exit route east of this property. And I need a direct line to the state police's organized crime unit. She paused. Tell them Gerald Fitch. Tell them it's connected to a pending corporate fraud matter with federal evidentiary implications. Cole was already moving. She looked back at Dante. If something happens to my sister because you moved her before she could be secured, nothing will happen to her, he said. Fitch's people will hold her until the exposure is managed. They won't hold her, Evelyn said. You just used the phrase hold her about my sister. He heard himself. Something moved across his face, not guilt, exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has been operating in a world where certain phrases have become so normalized that he no longer hears them from the outside until someone reflects them back. I know what you meant. She walked out. The corridor outside the sitting room was empty. She stood in it for 30 seconds with her back against the wall and her hand on her stomach and her eyes on the ceiling, doing the particular mathematics of a situation that had just added a new variable she hadn't planned for. Spasa in a vehicle, being taken somewhere by people who worked for a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been embedded in her family's corporate structure for 4 years, whose existence her father had discovered and documented and apparently left for her in a sealed vault in the basement of an estate that was currently hosting the aftermath of the most complicated morning of her life. She was 5 months pregnant. She was wearing her grandmother's wedding dress. Her sister was in a car somewhere on the Connecticut coast. And her father's private vault was waiting in the basement with whatever he'd found in the last 8 months of his life. She pushed off the wall and walked. She found Eleanor in the family corridor, away from the main hall, sitting in one of the small alcove chairs that had been in the estate since Evelyn's childhood, the chairs nobody ever used, except children playing and tired people stealing a moment. Eleanor looked up when Evelyn appeared, and her face did the thing it did when she was frightened, but refusing to be defeated by the fear. It went very still and very precise, all the soft parts locked down. Isabella is gone, Evelyn said. She said it without preamble because Eleanor was not a woman who benefited from preparation. She needed the information straight so she could process it straight. Someone picked her up from the East Service Gate. We think she's being held by a man connected to Dante's backing operation. Cole's team is looking for her. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Is she in danger? I don't know yet. I don't think it's immediate. They want her contained, not she stopped. We're going to find her. Eleanor looked at her for another moment. Then the vault. Yes, your father talked about it once. He was sick already. This was maybe 6 weeks before the end. He was having a clear day. He told me that he'd left something for you that you would only find if you were ready for it. He said the timing would be determined by the situation, not by him. Eleanor's hands were folded in her lap with the precise, controlled posture of a woman doing the internal work of not coming apart in a corridor, while her youngest daughter was somewhere on the Connecticut coast in a car driven by someone she didn't choose. He said you would know what to do with it. I don't know what's in it. No. Eleanor looked at her steadily. But you know what to do with information. You've always known that. He knew it before you did. Adrian appeared at the corridor's end. He walked quickly. His expression was the specific expression he'd had twice today, the expression of new information arriving before the last information was fully processed. She turned to face him. The Coastal Road cameras picked up the SUV, he said. It went east on Route 156, then turned south toward the Haverfield Marina. He paused. The marina has a private slip registry. One of the registered vessels is a 40-foot cabin cruiser. It was registered 6 months ago to a Delaware LLC. He looked at her. The LLC traces to Gerald Fitch. Haverfield Marina was 11 minutes from the estate. State Police, she said. I have Sergeant Diana Mercer from the Organized Crime Unit on the phone. She's familiar with the Fitch name. Adrian paused. She's also telling me that Fitch has been on their radar for 14 months in connection with a separate financial fraud investigation. They've been building a case. They don't have enough yet. They have his name connected to a corporate infiltration of a major family trust, a fraudulent succession filing, and the unlawful detention of a material witness, Evelyn said. Is that enough? Adrian said, she wants to speak with you directly. He handed her his phone. Sergeant Mercer was in her 40s, by the voice direct and economical, the voice of someone who had spent years working cases where every word in a phone call was potentially a record. She said, Miss Morty, I understand you've had an eventful morning. I need my sister secured before that boat leaves the slip, Evelyn said. Everything else can wait. We have a unit en route to Haverfield. ETA 9 minutes, a pause. The Fitch connection, how solid is your documentation on the corporate infiltration? I have a recorded confession from Dante Cuso, an authenticated amendment instrument, a chain of custody log on the evidence, and a federal judge who witnessed the authentication process in person approximately 90 minutes ago. A brief silence. Which judge? Patricia Halloran. Second Circuit. Another silence, slightly longer. Okay, Mercer said. We'll secure the marina. I'm going to need a formal statement from you today. You'll have it. Find my sister first. She handed the phone back to Adrian. Looked at him. How long until we know? 9 minutes for the unit to arrive. Add 2-3 minutes to secure the slip. 11 minutes. The same amount of time she'd had between the corridor and the altar that morning. The morning had a particular mathematical cruelty to it, giving her exactly enough time to act, but never enough margin to breathe. She walked back to the main hall. The room had thinned. A third of the guests had left quietly after brief conversations with Evelyn's staff, the kind of people who understood that being present at an ongoing situation was its own kind of record. The ones who remained were the ones with either a stake in what happened next or the particular constitution that makes certain people stay when others leave. Carmen Sessa was still there. He was at a corner table alone, a cup of coffee in front of him that he probably hadn't touched. He was in his late 60s, compact, dark-suited, with the face of a man who had spent his entire adult life reading rooms and had seen enough rooms that very few surprised him. He caught Evelyn's eye as she came in and made the slight chin lift of someone indicating they'd like a brief word. She went to him. He didn't stand. He said, very quietly, in a voice that didn't carry past the table, Fitch. She looked at him. You know him, she said. I know of him. He's been an irritant in the Boston corridor for about 5 years. Quietly buying into legitimate operations, building leverage he doesn't use openly. Sessa turned the coffee cup slightly. He had an approach made to my organization approximately 3 years ago. An intermediary. The proposal was that we allow him a passive position in one of our distribution networks in exchange for political cover he claimed to have access to. He paused. We declined. Why? Because men who buy in quietly and hold leverage without using it are waiting for something. The question is always what they're waiting for. He looked at her directly. Now I know what he was waiting for with your family. He wanted the Morty ports, she said. He wanted the northeastern corridor. Your ports, properly controlled through a succession mechanism, give him infrastructure reach that his current position can't buy legitimately. Sessa was quiet for a moment. Your father knew. I think your father spoke to mine, actually, years ago before my father died. There was a conversation. I don't know the details, but I know my father came away from it with a specific understanding that if the Morty succession ever looked unstable, there were people circling it. Leonard Morty had been talking to the Sessa family about Fitch years before Evelyn knew Fitch existed. Her father had been fighting this fight for a very long time. I want you to know, Sessa said carefully, that what I witnessed here today, the recording, the amendment, the protocol, that's a clean action. Handled correctly. Nobody in this room who matters will read it as weakness. He paused. That's not a favor I'm offering. It's information I think you need. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Fix the Fitch problem before it metastasizes. She walked away from the table. Her phone buzzed. Cole. She answered. Marina unit reached the slip, he said. The boat was still docked. Isabella was on it. She's okay, she's shaken, but she's physically fine. 2 individuals with her, both detained by state police. A brief pause. She's asking for you. Evelyn closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Tell her I'm coming, she said. She was at the estate's east entrance, moving toward the vehicle bay, when Adrian caught up with her. He was carrying his laptop, and his jacket was slightly askew for the first time all day, which was the closest he got to looking rattled. He said, Before you go, there's something on Dante's phone we didn't see the first pass through. She stopped. A contact list, encrypted, but our consultant broke the cipher 20 minutes ago. He opened the laptop. 12 names. Fitch is on it. So are 2 Connecticut state legislators. A Port Authority commissioner. And he paused. A name inside the organized crime unit. She looked at the screen. The name was 3 below Fitch. A detective-level rank, a name she didn't recognize. But the phone number beside it had a prefix she did recognize, the state police's Hartford division, the same division that Sergeant Mercer worked out of. Does Mercer know? She said. Not yet. Is it Mercer? No. Different name. But same unit, which meant there was someone in the unit that had just secured her sister who was on Dante's contact list. Someone who now knew that Fitch's name had surfaced, that Isabella was in custody, that the evidentiary record was expanding. Someone who, in the next hour, would be making a phone call. She stood very still. The vault, Adrian said quietly. Whatever your father documented about Fitch's infiltration, if it contains the names of the people Fitch has relationships with inside law enforcement, that documentation needs to be in the right hands before tonight. The right hands, she said. How many of those do we have left? He looked at her steadily. Fewer than this morning. More than none. She looked at the name on the screen for another 3 seconds. Then she looked at the estate around her, the grounds her father had purchased at 31, the walls he'd built around his family, the machinery he'd installed in the dark to protect a daughter from a betrayal he'd seen coming before she had. The vault was in the basement. Isabella was at the marina, 11 minutes away. There was a name on a contact list that was about to make a phone call. And somewhere inside her family's corporate structure, Gerald Fitch was still holding 2 minority positions in 2 port facility operating companies, waiting to see whether the morning's collapse had created enough chaos to open a door he'd been standing outside of for 4 years. She thought about what Sessa had said. Men who buy in quietly and hold leverage without using it are waiting for something. Fitch had been waiting for Dante's mechanism to deliver the Morty succession into a controllable form. Dante's mechanism had failed, which meant Fitch was now operating without his primary instrument, exposed at the edges, his name surfacing in a state police investigation and a federal judge's documentation. Men like Fitch, operating without their primary instrument, did not wait patiently. They moved. She looked at Adrian. Get Marcus. Get him to the vault now. Not in an hour now. She paused. And get that contact list to Halloran directly. Not through the state police unit. Directly to Halloran. And you? I'm going to get my sister. She walked out into the afternoon light, toward the vehicle bay, toward the coastal road, toward a marina 11 minutes east where her younger sister was sitting on a boat that belonged to a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been inside her family's walls for 4 years, who her father had died trying to map, and who was now for the first time fully visible. Visibility, her father had taught her, was the beginning of the end for men who operated in the dark. She got in the car. Cole was driving. She looked out the window at the estate, receding behind her the white chair still on the ceremonial lawn, the magnolia arch still standing, the ribbon still moving in the afternoon wind, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only when everything simple has been stripped away, that this was no longer about a wedding or a marriage or even a man who had tried to take what was hers. This was about who Gerald Fitch had made deals with and what her father had found, and whether the documents in the vault were enough to end it, before Fitch decided that containing Isabella had been insufficient, and that the Morty problem required a more permanent solution. Cole turned onto the coastal road. The estate disappeared behind the tree line. The water appeared on the right gray-blue and flat in the afternoon light, the kind of water that looked calm from a distance and was cold all the way to the bottom. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number, she answered. A voice she didn't recognize, male, unhurried. The particular tone of a man accustomed to being the calmest person in any conversation he chose to enter. "Ms. Morty," the voice said, "my name is Gerald Fitch. I think it's time we spoke directly. This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely fictional and invented." She didn't answer immediately. 3 seconds of coastal road passing out to the window tree line, guardrail, the gray-blue water appearing and disappearing between gaps in the vegetation, and then she said, "How did you get this number?" "The same way I get most things," Fitch said, carefully and in advance. His voice was what she'd expected from the shape of him that had been forming in her mind for the last 40 minutes. Measured, comfortable with silence. The voice of a man who initiated contact on his own timeline and considered the initiation itself a demonstration of control. "My sister is at Haverfield Marina," she said. "State police are with her." "I know. My people cooperated fully with Sergeant Mercer's unit. Isabella is unharmed and free to leave." A brief pause. "I want to be clear that what happened this morning was Dante's operation, not mine. I had a financial relationship with him. I did not authorize the succession mechanism or the medical documentation strategy. Those were his decisions. Your name is on his contact list. Many names are on many contact lists. That's not authorization." She watched the water through the window. Cole was driving at a steady, controlled speed, eyes forward, giving her the silence she needed. "What do you want, Mr. Fitch? I want to have a direct conversation before this situation calcifies into something that damages both our interests unnecessarily." His tone didn't change, no urgency, no pressure. Just the flat certainty of a man laying out a proposition he believes is rational. "You've had an extremely difficult morning. The people who were working against you have been exposed. The mechanisms they built have been neutralized. That's a significant accomplishment. There are aspects of this situation that, if mishandled, will create problems for your family that extend well beyond Dante Cuso, such as the 2 port positions I hold through my investment vehicle. A proper legal review of those acquisitions will take 8 to 12 months. During that time, the operating uncertainty will affect your family's financing relationships, your port authority contracts, and potentially your federal operating licenses in Providence and New Haven." He paused. "I'm offering an alternative, which is a clean divestiture. I exit both positions at my acquisition cost, no profit, no negotiation. The transaction is structured as a standard buyback under existing charter provisions. It closes in 60 days. No litigation, no regulatory entanglement, no public record of how the positions were originally established." Another pause. "In exchange, your family's investigation stops at Dante. My name doesn't appear in any filing or testimony." She let the offer sit in the air for a moment. Watched the marina entrance appear through the windshield, a parking lot, a chain-link gate, 2 state police cruisers angled across the access road. "You're asking me to let you walk," she said. "I'm asking you to make a practical decision rather than an expensive one. The position you hold in my family's operating companies was acquired through a layered structure designed to conceal your identity as the beneficial owner. That's securities fraud." She kept her voice level. "The state police organized crime unit has your name. Judge Halloran has your name. The contact list on Dante's phone has your name alongside 2 state legislators and a detective in the Hartford division." A slight pause. The first one that felt like recalibration rather than emphasis. "The detective," she said, "is going to make a phone call in the next hour. Probably already has. I assume that call was supposed to give you a window to manage your exposure before it reached the federal level." She paused. "I'm going to assume you know I know that, because you're a careful man and you've been watching this situation all morning." Silence for 4 seconds. "You're very good," Fitch said. "I know." She looked at Cole. He glanced at her in the rear view. She pointed at the marina entrance and held up 2 fingers 2 minutes. He nodded. "Here's my answer. I'm going to get out of this car and walk into that marina and see my sister. While I'm doing that, Adrian Cho is delivering your contact list to Judge Halloran, who is preparing a referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Haven. The detective in the Hartford division is being flagged to internal affairs through a separate channel that doesn't touch the state police chain of command." She paused. "Your window is already closed. Whatever you thought this call would accomplish, it's done." Another silence. Longer. When Fitch spoke again, the measured comfort was still in his voice, but something underneath it had changed. Not panic, not anger, something colder and more deliberate, the sound of a man shifting from negotiation to a different register entirely. Ms. Morty, I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what you're handling here. The interests I represent extend well beyond two port positions. The people who've been patient with this process are not going to remain patient once they understand the exposure. He paused. Your father understood that. That's why he moved carefully. That's why he didn't act on what he found. The mention of her father landed like something physical. She said, "What do you know about what my father found?" "I know he found enough to act, and I know he chose not to." Fitch's voice was very careful now. That was a wise decision, made by a wise man who understood that some problems are better managed than eliminated. "I'm offering you the same arrangement he had." She felt the cold move through her, starting in her chest and spreading outward, the specific cold of a revelation arriving at exactly the wrong moment. Her father. Her father who had spent the last 8 months of his life quietly mapping Fitch's infiltration. Her father who had built Black Ledger and the witness list and the vault with the sealed documents. Her father who had written on an index card, "I just wanted to make sure the machinery was in place." Had her father made a deal? Had he found the full scope of it and concluded that the exposure was too dangerous and pulled back, accepting a managed coexistence rather than a fight he calculated he couldn't win? And if the vault contained documentation he'd assembled and then chosen not to use, was Black Ledger not a weapon her father had built for her to fight with, but an insurance policy he'd built to make sure she didn't have to? Cole pulled into the marina lot and stopped. She said, "I'll call you back." She ended the call before Fitch could respond. She sat in the stopped car for 10 seconds. Her hand was on her stomach. The baby moved a small specific pressure, nothing dramatic, just the physical fact of him, present and real and requiring nothing from her except that she keep moving. She got out. The marina smelled like salt water and diesel and the particular cold metal smell of boat hardware. 2 state police officers were at the gate. Cole showed credentials and they were waved through. The slip was at the end of the second dock, the 40-foot cabin cruiser rocking gently, 2 more officers on the dock. A plainclothes woman Evelyn recognized from the voice before she saw the badge. Sergeant Diana Mercer was compact, mid-40s, wearing a gray jacket over a dark shirt, with the particular physical stillness of someone who had learned to conserve energy in situations that required being ready to move fast. She met Evelyn at the dock entrance and said, "Without preamble, your sister is fine. She's below deck. The 2 individuals who transported her are in custody." She paused. She came voluntarily, according to both of them. No physical coercion. "Voluntarily?" Evelyn said. She received a message on a secondary phone we didn't know about. It told her that her safety couldn't be guaranteed if she remained at the estate and gave her an exit option. Mercer held her gaze. She made a bad decision under pressure. She's not the first person to do that today. Evelyn nodded. "Fitch called me. In the car. 10 minutes ago." Mercer's expression didn't change, but something behind it sharpened.
"What did he say?
He offered a clean divestiture of the port positions in exchange for his name being removed from any filing or testimony. She paused. "He also told me he had an arrangement with my father." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "What kind of arrangement?" "He implied my father found the full scope of the infiltration and chose not to act. That they reached an accommodation." She looked at Mercer directly. "I don't know if it's true, but I need to know before tonight, because my father left documentation in a private vault, and I need to go into that vault with a clear understanding of what I'm going to find." "One of my unit," Mercer said quietly. "Detective Ray Tolliver. Hartford Division." "Yes, I know. I flagged it to my captain 40 minutes ago, through a channel that doesn't touch Tolliver directly." Her jaw was tight. "He doesn't know yet that we know." She paused. "When Fitch called you, that's the action of a man who has just discovered his internal warning system is compromised. He's moving without the intelligence he thought he had." She looked at the water. "That makes him more dangerous, not less." Evelyn understood that immediately. A careful man operating with bad information about his own exposure was exactly the most dangerous version of that man. "I need to get my sister and get back to the estate," she said. "Go, I'll have 2 units follow you back." Mercer paused. "And Miss Morty, whatever's in that vault. If it touches Fitch's network in law enforcement or government, bring it to Halloran directly." Not to me, not to my captain. Halloran, Adrian's already working that channel. Mercer nodded once. Go get your sister. Isabella was below deck in the cabin's small seating area, still in the ceremony dress, holding a glass of water with both hands, like it was the only stable object in her immediate environment. She looked up when Evelyn appeared in the cabin doorway, and her face did something complicated relief and shame, occupying the same space simultaneously, neither one able to fully displace the other. Evelyn sat down across from her. I panicked, Isabella said. I know. I got a message on the phone Dante gave me 6 months ago. I kept it, which was stupid, and it said that if the morning went wrong, I needed to leave before the investigation formal started because there were things I knew that would put me in a position. She stopped. I know how it sounds. It sounds like Fitch used the same play on you that Dante did. Found the thing you were most afraid of and handed you a story that made running feel like safety. Isabella looked at the glass in her hands. I was afraid of you, she said quietly. Not physically, I was afraid of what you'd do. What this would mean. She paused. I know I helped him. I know what I gave him. And I know that some of the damage, she stopped again. There are things I told him that I can't take back. What things? The Black Ledger. I told him it existed. That Adrian had sealed instructions. I didn't know the phrase or the specific mechanism, but I told him the protocol existed. She looked up. He already knew, apparently. But I confirmed it. Evelyn absorbed this. Dante had known about Black Ledger through Marcus's disclosure. Isabella had confirmed it through a separate channel, which had allowed Dante to build his timeline around it from 2 independent sources rather than one. It didn't change the outcome of this morning, but it told her how thoroughly her family had been mapped. Was there anything else? Isabella hesitated. Isabella. Dad's vault, she said quietly. I didn't know what was in it. I didn't even know where it was exactly, but I knew he had one. I mentioned it to Dante once, maybe 8 months ago, early on, when I thought I was just talking. She swallowed. He asked about it once after that, very casually. I told him I didn't know anything specific. He didn't push. He hadn't needed to push. He'd filed the information and moved on, the way careful men filed information they expected to need eventually. Evelyn stood. Let's go. Isabella stood. Are you? She stopped. Started over. Are we? I don't know yet, Evelyn said. But right now we need to move. The drive back to the estate took 13 minutes. Cole drove. The 2 state police units followed. Nobody spoke in the car. Isabella sat with her hands in her lap and watched the coastal road unreel behind them through the rear window, and Evelyn watched the road ahead and thought about her father. She thought about what Fitch had said. That was a wise decision, made by a wise man who understood that some problems are better managed than eliminated. She thought about the index card. I just wanted to make sure the machinery was in place. She thought about the distinction between those 2 sentences. Between a man who had made peace with a threat and a man who had built a system to defeat one. They felt like different men. They felt like different decisions. But she hadn't been in her father's last 8 months. She hadn't seen what he'd seen or calculated what he'd calculated. She didn't know. The vault would tell her. The estate came into view. The guest lot was half empty, more departures in the hour she'd been gone. The ceremonial lawn was visible from the drive, and she could see that someone had begun taking down the white chairs, which felt both practical and unbearably sad in a way she didn't examine directly. Marcus was in the East Wing study when she arrived. He looked like a man who had aged 6 years and 6 hours, the gray in his hair more pronounced somehow, the heaviness around his eyes specific and new. Adrian was beside him. Between them on the desk was a printed copy of Dante's contact list and Adrian's preliminary audit of pending corporate filings, which ran to 4 pages. She stood at the door for a moment, looking at both of them. Fitch called me, she said. Both men looked up. She relayed the conversation in under 3 minutes, the offer, the implication about her father, the window reference, Mercer's assessment of what the call meant about Fitch's situational awareness. When she finished, Marcus sat very still with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the window. Your father didn't make a deal, Marcus said. She looked at him. I was with him. The last 8 months I was with him. Through most of it. He found the Fitch positions approximately 10 months before he died, not 8. And for 2 months he did consider the managed coexistence approach. He was sick. He was trying to assess what he had the capacity to fight. Marcus's voice was steady and flat. But he didn't make a deal. He decided he couldn't leave you something with a quiet threat embedded in it and call it a legacy. He spent the last 6 months of his life building the documentation. All of it. The vault contains everything he found. He paused. That's what Fitch is afraid of. He doesn't know your father didn't make a deal. He assumed it because your father stopped moving against him in the last months, because he was dying, not because he'd capitulated. Evelyn held Marcus's gaze for a long moment. "Take me to the vault," she said. The vault was in the estate's lowest level, a room she'd known existed since childhood, as the place where her father kept original documents, deeds, old contracts, things that required physical security rather than digital. She'd been in it twice, once as a teenager when her father showed her where the family's core legal instruments were stored, and once after his death when Adrian had retrieved the operating documents for the succession. She had not known about the separate sealed section until today. Marcus unlocked it with a physical key and a 6-digit code that Adrian provided from the Black Ledger instructions. The sealed section was behind a false panel in the vault's rear wall, a shallow secondary space, barely 4 feet deep, lined with fireproof document storage. Inside, 6 sealed envelopes, 3 hardbound ledgers, 2 encrypted drives, and a small video camera on a tripod aimed at the chair facing the panel door. And a recorded video message from her father. She watched it standing up, because sitting down felt like something she might not be able to recover from quickly enough. Leonard Morty on the screen was thinner than she remembered him in health. This was clearly recorded in the final months, the illness visible in the set of his shoulders, and the careful way he breathed between sentences. But his eyes were entirely his own, sharp and specific, and aimed at her with the particular directness of a man who is not performing for anyone. He said, "Evelyn, if you're watching this," Black Ledger ran. "That means something I spent the last year hoping wouldn't happen did happen, and you handled it. I know you handled it because you're the only person who knows the phrase, and I designed it so the vault would only open in sequence after the protocol was activated." He paused for breath. "What's in this room is everything I found on Gerald Fitch. The layered acquisition structure, the beneficial ownership chain, the names of the government officials he has relationships with in Connecticut, in the federal system, and in law enforcement. 2 of those names are federal. One of them is significant enough that Fitch has been able to operate without federal prosecution for 11 years because of the cover that relationship provides." He stopped, breathed. "I want to explain why I didn't act on this while I was alive. I told myself it was because I was sick and the timing wasn't right and I needed more before I moved. Some of that was true. But the full truth is that I was frightened. Not for myself, for you. Fitch is not Dante Cuso. He's not a man running a succession scheme. He's a man with federal protection and a network that extends into law enforcement at multiple levels. And moving against him without the right structure in place first would have put you in a position I didn't have the strength left to protect you from." He paused again. "So I built the structure. That's what's in these envelopes. That's what's on the drives. Not just documentation strategy. The specific sequence for introducing this evidence that bypasses the compromised channels and reaches the right federal level without being intercepted or buried." He looked directly into the camera. "Adrian knows a prosecutor. His name is in the red envelope. He's been waiting for this for 8 years. Call him." The recording ran for another 4 minutes, walking through the contents of each envelope in sequence. She listened to every word. When it ended, she stood in the small sealed room for 30 seconds without moving. Then she picked up the red envelope. Adrian opened it. "Read the name inside." His expression moved through something she didn't have a word for: recognition, grief, relief, the particular emotion of a man who has been carrying a name in his memory for 8 years and has finally been given permission to use it. "I need to make a call," he said. "Make it." He stepped out. She stayed in the vault. Marcus was in the doorway, watching her with the careful attention of a man who has surrendered his right to help, but hasn't been able to stop caring. "He trusted you with this," she said, "the vault location. The code. He told me the code 14 months ago. He said I would know when to use it." Marcus was quiet. "I think he knew my judgment had already failed him. He gave me the code anyway. He said everyone deserves one chance to correct their worst mistake." She didn't respond to that. She picked up the first of the 3 ledgers and opened it. The handwriting was her father's, the cramped leftward slanting script, covering page after page in the precise, organized way he had documented everything he'd ever considered important. names, dates, transaction structures, the specific mechanism by which Fitch had concealed his beneficial ownership through 4 layers of Delaware LLCs and 2 offshore holding entities. The government officials, their names in her father's handwriting, specific, documented, cross-referenced with the transactions that established the relationships. And at the back of the ledger, in her father's hand, a single line that she read twice before she understood it fully. The federal protection has a name, Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Marsh, District of Connecticut. He's been on Fitch's payroll since 2019. Proof is on Drive 2. The room was absolutely silent. An Assistant U.S. Attorney in the District of Connecticut. Fitch's federal cover for 11 years. The reason no federal prosecution had ever gotten traction. Her phone buzzed. "Cole," she answered. 2 vehicles, Cole said. Came through the North Perimeter Gate 60 seconds ago. They had estate credentials catering vendor clearance. But the vendor logged out 2 hours ago. His voice was controlled and tight. 4 individuals on foot, moving toward the main house. Armed. She closed the ledger. "Where's Dante?" she said. "Still in the East sitting room. My team has him. Lock the sitting room. Lock this level. Get Adrian and Isabella to the East Wing study and keep them there." She was already moving toward the vault door. How long until they reached the main structure? 2 minutes. Maybe less. Fitch had moved, not negotiation anymore. Not careful and measured and patient. He'd sent people through her gate with stolen credentials, and whatever instruction they'd been given, it wasn't conversation. She looked at Marcus. "Can you fight?" He looked at her, the specific look of a man being asked a question that requires him to decide who he is right now in this moment after the morning he'd just lived through. "Yes," he said. "Then stay close," she said, and walked out of the vault into the corridor, into the sound of Cole's team moving through the estate above them, into the specific and absolute reality of a fight her father had spent the last year of his life building the conditions for her to win. Her heartbeat was in her ears. The baby moved again, that same small specific pressure, and she put her hand flat on her stomach for exactly 1 second, 1 full second of contact, and then she took her hand away and kept moving, because the machinery her father had built was in place, and she was the only person left who knew how to run it. And Gerald Fitch had just made the last miscalculation of his carefully managed career by sending armed men into Leonard Morty's house to frighten a woman who had stopped being frightened approximately 6 hours ago and had been doing something far more dangerous ever since. She reached the top of the basement stairs. Cole was at the end of the corridor, 2 of his team flanking him, all 3 moving with the practiced economy of people who had trained for exactly this. He looked at her and said, "East side. They're at the east entrance." The east entrance, the same glass-paneled doors she'd watched Dante walk toward that morning. The same corridor where she'd stood with her back against the wall 40 minutes after the recording played, doing the mathematics of a situation that kept adding variables. "The estate security panel," she said to Cole. "Can you lock the glass doors from the corridor control?" "Already done. Cameras on the east approach?" "Live feed on my tablet." He turned it toward her. 4 figures moving along the estate's eastern exterior wall, not running. Moving with the controlled pace of people who know the layout they're working in and believe they have time. "They have the vendor floor plan," he said. "They know the interior." "How?" He didn't answer, because they both knew the answer, the same way Dante had known about Black Ledger, and the same way the catering credentials had been authentic until they weren't. Information that had been inside the family and had traveled outward through channels that were still being mapped. She looked at the tablet. 4 figures. The east entrance locked. Her team's inside, Dante in the east sitting room. The federal documentation in the vault below her feet. Adrian in the study with the red envelope and a phone call already in progress. She needed 3 things. She needed those 4 men not to reach the vault level. She needed Adrian's call to complete. And she needed Fitch to stay on the phone long enough to say something that finished him. She called him back. He answered on the second ring. "I've been in the vault," she said, walking toward the east corridor with Cole beside her. "I've read the ledgers. I know about Drive 2. I know about Daniel Marsh." A silence, longer than any previous one. When Fitch spoke, the measured comfort was gone entirely. "This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely fictional and invented. Fitch said nothing for 4 seconds. Not the calculated silence he'd been using all afternoon, the deliberate pauses of a man who controlled the tempo of every conversation he entered. This was different. This was the silence of a man who has just heard a name he believed was buried and is now performing the rapid, ugly mathematics of exposure. Daniel Marsh, she said again, walking down the east corridor with Cole at her left shoulder, the tablet in Cole's hand showing 4 figures still moving along the exterior wall. Assistant U.S. Attorney, District of Connecticut. On your payroll since 2019. My father documented the transactions. Dates, amounts, the specific accounts. She kept her voice even. He was thorough. Fitch's voice had shed the comfortable register entirely. What was underneath it was not panic, she had to give him that. It was something more disciplined than panic. The cold focus of a man deciding in real time which version of this situation he could still survive. Whatever Leonard documented is being transmitted to the U.S. Attorney's office in New York right now, she said. Not Connecticut, New York. Outside Marsh's jurisdiction entirely. She stopped walking. Adrian is on the phone with a federal prosecutor who has been waiting 8 years to make this case. Whatever window you thought you had closed 4 minutes ago. A silence. Then the 4 men on your property. Yes, they'll stand down. They'll stand down now, she said, or I'll add obstruction and criminal trespass to the federal referral package and make sure Sergeant Mercer's unit has their descriptions and vehicle information before they reach the perimeter road. She heard him breathe. Once. The specific sound of a man accepting the shape of what has just happened. Call them off, she said, and then stay on this line. She looked at Cole. He was already on his radio, coordinating with the exterior team. She watched the tablet, the 4 figures slowing, stopping. One of them produced a phone. Whatever instruction came through the phone made all 4 of them turn and begin moving back the way they'd come. The same controlled pace reversed. Nothing hurried. Nothing that would make the situation worse than it already was. Cole said, quietly, they're pulling back. She kept the phone at her ear. Fitch said, what do you want? And there it was. The question that the whole morning had been moving toward, under everything, the recordings and the amendments and the vault and the marina and the contact list. All of it compressing down to this, a man who had operated for 11 years behind federal cover, who had embedded himself in her family's corporate structure, who had backed a succession scheme and sent armed men through a catering gate, asking her what she wanted. She thought about her father on the video screen, the thinness in his shoulders, the way he'd breathed carefully between sentences. 8 months of work in the last year of his life, building something he was afraid he wouldn't have the strength to use. She thought about what he'd said, I couldn't leave you something with a quiet threat embedded in it and call it a legacy. Full cooperation, she said, with the federal investigation. Every document, every account, every name in your network. Including Marsh, including the legislators, including whoever you have in the Port Authority. She paused. You don't negotiate the terms. You don't control the timeline. You hand everything to the prosecutor Adrian is speaking with right now, and you do it before the end of today. And if I do, then the nature of your cooperation becomes part of the federal record, which is the only thing left that can affect how the rest of your life goes. She paused. Or you can try to fight it. With Leonard Morty's documentation and Judge Halloran's referral, and the authenticated recording of Dante Cuso in a room full of federal judges, she let that sit. Choose. The silence this time was 12 seconds. She counted them. Then Fitch said, give me Adrian Cho's direct line. She ended the call, stood in the east corridor for a moment. The estate was quiet around her, the specific quiet of a place that has just exhaled after holding its breath for hours. The ambient noise of the few remaining staff moving through spaces, the distant sound of Cole's exterior team, confirming the perimeter clear through his radio. Marcus was behind her. He'd stayed close, as she'd asked, and she turned to look at him. He was holding himself with the rigid, careful posture of a man who has nothing left to pretend and is not yet sure what he looks like without the pretense. It's done, she said. He exhaled, a single long breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and held for a very long time. What happens now, he said, not about Fitch, about himself. The question was entirely about himself. Now you go give Adrian everything. Every communication with Dante, every introduction. Every document you saw, all of it. She held his gaze. And then you and I are going to have a much longer conversation. Not today, he nodded. Then he said, very quietly, I loved your father. I know you did, she said. That's the only reason this is a conversation and not something else. She watched him walk toward the study. Then she turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward the east sitting room, toward the last person in this building she hadn't fully finished with. Cole unlocked the sitting room. Dante was standing at the window when she entered, not seated, standing, which told her he'd been on his feet for a while, pacing or thinking, or some combination of both. He turned when she came in. He looked, for the first time all day, like a man whose resources had run out. The composure was still there. It was structural in him. She understood, not performed, but it was carrying weight now. She could see the weight. She sat down. After a moment, he sat across from her. Fitch is cooperating, she said. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, exactly recalculation. He folded that fast. He had one piece of cover left, and my father removed it years ago. He just didn't know it until today. Dante was quiet. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. The prosecutor Phaedron called. Yes. Federal case? Federal case. She paused. You're in it. Your cooperation will determine a significant amount about how that goes for you. Adrian can refer you to counsel who will explain the specifics. He absorbed this, the succession mechanism, the medical documentation strategy. He said it flat, without the deflection he'd used earlier. I understand how that looks. I don't need you to understand how it looks, she said. I need you to understand what it was. He met her eyes. What it was, he repeated. You decided that the right approach to a woman who was 5 months pregnant with your child was to manufacture evidence of her mental incapacity so you could take control of everything she'd spent her life building. She kept her voice level. She wasn't interested in volume right now. Volume was for people who needed the room to understand how they felt. She knew how she felt, and you used her sister to do it, and her uncle. You took the real fractures in her family and you pressed on them until they opened wide enough for you to walk through. He was quiet. The baby, she said. You need to understand something about the baby. Evelyn, he is a Morty, she said. His name will be Leonardo Morty. He will know who his father is, and he will know the full truth of what happened this morning when he is old enough to understand it. Because I am not going to build his life on a managed version of events. And if you want any kind of relationship with him, any kind at all, it will be on terms that I determine, through whatever legal structure the family's attorneys construct, and it will require that you cooperate fully with every aspect of the investigation, and that you never, in any form, attempt to use him as leverage against this family. Dante's jaw tightened. He's my son, he is. And that is the only reason I am telling you directly instead of leaving it entirely to counsel. She stood. Cooperate. That's the one path left that has anything worth having at the end of it. She walked out. The main hall was nearly empty. The last of the guests had gone while she was in the basement, the chairs cleared, the catering tables being broken down by staff, who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the work required doing regardless of the circumstances that surrounded it. The magnolia arch was still standing on the ceremonial lawn. She could see it through the glass doors, lit now by the afternoon's declining light, the white ribbons gone sticks and still in the absence of wind. Eleanor was in the family sitting room off the main hall. She was alone, and she had changed out of the ceremony dress into something simpler, dark slacks. A gray sweater which told Evelyn that someone had retrieved Eleanor's things from the suite and that her mother had used the last hour to make the practical adjustment from the morning's version of the day to whatever this was now. Eleanor looked up when Evelyn came in and held her gaze with the steady, careful attention she'd held throughout the entire morning, every bit of it without breaking. Evelyn sat beside her on the small sofa, closer than they usually sat. She was tired in a way that had moved past physical into something more total, the fatigue of a person who has been completely present for an extremely long time and whose body has finally begun presenting the invoice. Isabella, Eleanor said. She's in the study with Adrian. She's giving a formal statement. Evelyn paused. She's okay. Eleanor nodded slowly. And Marcus, also giving a statement. And the men who came through the gate. Gone, Fitch recalled them. He's cooperating with the federal investigation. Eleanor sat with all of that for a moment. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was doing what late afternoon light does in coastal Connecticut in autumn, going gold and long-shadowed across the grounds, making everything look briefly more beautiful than it is before the dark comes. Your father, Eleanor said. He built all of it, Evelyn said. The protocol, the vault, the witness list, the prosecutor contact. He spent the last year of his life building what I needed, and then she stopped. Breathed. He trusted me to find it. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he told me, near the end, that the hardest thing about being a parent is accepting that the child you raise to be capable is going to have to use that capability in situations you can't protect them from. She paused. He said he kept trying to find a way to be there for it. And then he accepted that the best he could do was leave the right tools and get out of the way. Evelyn put her head back against the sofa, looked at the ceiling. The baby moved that small, specific pressure she was beginning to recognize as his particular rhythm, different from the general heaviness of carrying him, a distinct and particular thing that was its own. I haven't cried, she said. No. I don't know when that's going to happen. It'll happen when it happens, Eleanor said. Your father went 6 weeks after the diagnosis without crying. Then one morning I found him in the kitchen at 4 a.m. reading the newspaper, just sitting there with the newspaper open and tears coming down his face. He wasn't making a sound. He just looked up at me and said, "It finally caught up. That's all." Evelyn looked at her mother. Eleanor's eyes were dry, and her posture was exactly what it had been, all morning, upright and precise, and containing everything that could not be allowed to spill in any direction that would make things harder for the people around her. But her hand, resting on the sofa cushion between them, moved slightly toward Evelyn's hand. Not grasping, just close enough to touch if Evelyn wanted to be touched. Evelyn turned her hand over, felt her mother's fingers close around hers. They sat like that for a while. The formal process consumed the next 6 weeks in the way that formal processes consume time when the underlying substance is real steadily, without drama, requiring constant presence and decision-making, and the management of moving pieces that never quite stayed still. Adrian coordinated with the federal prosecutor, whose name was Vincent Okafor, and who had indeed been waiting 8 years, building and losing and rebuilding a case against Gerald Fitch's network every time a promising lead ran into a wall that turned out to have Marsh's fingerprints on it. Leonard Morty's documentation on Drive 2 provided the direct evidentiary link between Marsh and Fitch's financial instruments that Okafor had never been able to establish independently. Marsh resigned from the U.S. Attorney's Office on a Thursday morning, cited personal reasons in a 2-sentence statement, and was indicted on a Tuesday the following week. Fitch's cooperation, once secured, was thorough in the way that cooperation is thorough when the alternative is facing federal charges without the asset of your primary protective relationship. He handed Okafor 11 years of financial records, 2 sets of offshore accounts, and the names of 6 government officials whose relationships with his operation ranged from passive recipients of benefit to active facilitators of obstruction. The 2 Connecticut state legislators on Dante's contact list were among them. One resigned before the indictments came. The other didn't, and the subsequent proceedings were very public and very thorough. The Fitch positions in the Mortyport facility operating companies were unwound through a court-supervised divestiture process that took 9 weeks rather than the 60 days he'd offered. The difference was that the court-supervised version created a public record and a legal precedent that made the same entry point unavailable to anyone who might attempt it in the future. Adrian had argued for that version specifically. Evelyn had agreed. Dante's case moved through federal channels with the particular speed that cases move when the defendant's cooperation is genuine and the evidentiary record is comprehensive. His succession scheme, the medical documentation arrangement, the financial instruments built to support it, all of it documented, all of it in Okafor's hands within 30 days of the wedding that never happened. His attorneys negotiated. The negotiations took 4 months. The outcome was a guilty plea to 3 federal counts, a financial penalty that stripped the operational structure of his New York logistics firm, and a sentence that would determine the next chapter of his life in terms he had not written and could not revise. He did not attempt to contact Evelyn directly after the sitting room conversation. His attorney sent a letter, formal and brief, acknowledging paternity and expressing a desire to establish a legal framework for eventual contact with the child. Adrian responded with the framework Evelyn had outlined: conditions, timeline, supervised structure, the full truth available to the child when the child was ready for it. Dante's attorney indicated acceptance. She didn't know what she felt about that. She thought she would be figuring it out for a long time. Isabella's formal cooperation with the investigation took 3 sessions with Okafor's team and produced a detailed account of her 8 months of contact with Dante, what she'd provided, what she'd been told, what she'd chosen to believe because it was easier than the alternative. The investigators found no independent criminal exposure in her actions. What she'd passed to Dante fell, just barely, on the side of catastrophic judgment rather than criminal conduct, a line that Evelyn suspected was thinner than it appeared and that Isabella would spend years being aware of. The formal process of what happened between the two of them took longer and moved with none of the procedural efficiency of federal proceedings. There were conversations that lasted hours and ended inconclusively. There were conversations that lasted 10 minutes and said more than the long ones. There was one afternoon in the 4th week when Isabella arrived at the estate unannounced and stood in the main halls and said, without preamble, "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me. I don't think that's a thing I've earned the right to ask for yet." And Evelyn had looked at her for a moment and said, "Come in. There's coffee." It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't resolution. It was the beginning of the work, which was slower and less clean than either of them wanted, and which both of them were apparently willing to do. Marcus resigned from every formal position in the family's organizational structure in a written letter that was 7 pages long. The first 6 pages were documentation and process how his responsibilities would transfer, which relationships he would need to brief, to whom, what the transition timeline should look like to minimize disruption. The 7th page was a single paragraph that was addressed only to Evelyn, and that she read once and did not read again, but also did not destroy. He relocated to the family's property in Maine, a smaller house, quiet, away from the operational center, and Adrian managed his ongoing cooperation with investigators. He called the estate once a month. She took the calls. They talked about practical matters and occasionally about her father, and never directly about the morning of the wedding, because everything that needed to be said about that morning had been said in the east corridor of the estate on the day itself. She did not hate him. She had examined the question carefully because she thought hatred might be simpler than whatever she actually felt, which was a complex and uncomfortable combination of grief and anger and the particular sorrow of watching a person you trusted make decisions that revealed them to be someone different than you'd believed. She thought about what her father had written on the index card. Everyone deserves one chance to correct their worst mistake. She thought her father had been both right about that and wrong about how easy it was to live with the correcting. The estate in October was different than it had been in September. The floral arrangements were long gone. The ceremonial lawn had been cleared and returned to its ordinary state open grass, the paths her father had put in 30 years ago, the old oak at the eastern edge that she had climbed as a child, and that her son would presumably climb in some future version of this life she was building. The magnolia arch had been taken down the day after the wedding. She'd made that decision herself and had not spent much time thinking about it. She walked the grounds in the evenings, when the weather permitted not for the walking specifically, but because her body was making increasingly pointed suggestions about the virtues of regular movement, and because the grounds in the late afternoon light were one of the few places where the business of the day could be set aside long enough to think about something other than the business of the day. She was thinking in those evenings about what came next. Not in the strategic sense. She had clarity about the strategic landscape. Perhaps more clarity than she'd warning of a September 14th, because you understand a system differently after it's been tested to near failure. She knew which relationships were real and which had been performance. She knew where the structural vulnerabilities were. She knew the names of every person in her family's extended network who had contact with Dante or Fitch, and she knew which of those contacts were passive and which were actionable. She was thinking about the other kind of next. The kind that was harder to plan for. Leonardo was born on a Tuesday morning in November, 7 weeks after the wedding that had not happened. He arrived 3 days early and with the particular urgency of a child who has decided on his own timeline, which Evelyn found, even in the specific exhaustion of labor, somewhat characteristic. He was 6 pounds 14 ounces and had her father's forehead and her mother's mouth, and the particular expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere unexpected and is taking stock. She held him for the first time with the careful, overwhelmed attention of something more important than anything they have ever handled. And the thing she noticed first before the weight of him, before the smell of him, before any of the things she had read about and been told about, was how completely real he was. Not abstract. Not the pregnancy or the future or the complication or the leverage that other people had tried to make him. Just real. Just a person who had been waiting to be himself. She named him Leonardo after her father. Eleanor cried in the delivery room. Actually cried, which Evelyn had seen from her mother perhaps 4 times in her entire life, and which felt in this context like the most appropriate possible response to the moment. Isabella was in the waiting room. She had asked, 2 days before the due date, whether she was allowed to come. Evelyn had said yes. When the nurse brought word to the waiting room, Isabella sat very still for a moment, and then she put her face in her hands, and Eleanor, who had come out to tell her, sat beside her and led her. She was not in the room. That would come later if it came, in its own time. But she was in the waiting room. That was something. Adrian brought paperwork to the hospital. On the second day, he was constitutionally incapable of not being useful, which she had always appreciated, and she reviewed 2 documents and signed one, and told him the third could wait until she had slept more than 4 hours in a row, at which point he said he thought that was entirely reasonable, and sat in the chair by the window and read his phone for 40 minutes rather than leaving, which was his version of keeping company. She thought about her father a great deal in those early days. Not in the grief-soaked way she'd thought about him in the months immediately after his death, but in a different way, more like conversation, the internal version of it. The way you replay a person's voice when you're in a situation they would have had something helpful to say about. She thought about what he would have said looking at Leonardo. She thought he would not have said much. He had not been a man of large emotional announcements. He would have held him, probably, with the same careful, overwhelmed attention she'd felt herself, and then he would have handed him back and said something dry and specific about the forehead. She thought about what he'd left her. Not the documents, or the protocol, or the vault. She'd been thinking about those for weeks and would continue to think about them. She thought about the index card. The way he'd said, "I just wanted to make sure the machinery was in place." She thought about the distinction her father had always drawn, that he had never wanted her to be a woman who was never hurt, never betrayed, never tested. He'd understood that the world he'd built and that she'd inherited was not a world that permitted that kind of safety. What he'd wanted was for her to be a woman who, when the test came, had the tools and the understanding and the specific unbreakable, something that allowed her to come through it and still be herself on the other side. She looked at Leonardo sleeping in the hospital bassinet beside her bed. The particular total unconsciousness of a newborn, the way they sleep, as though sleep is the most serious thing they have ever undertaken. She thought, I came through it, not unchanged, not without cost. The cost was real, and she was not going to minimize it or dress it up in the language of growth and transformation, because the cost had been paid in things that mattered: her sister's betrayal, her uncle's failure, her own capacity for trust, which would not be the same kind of trust again, the unbothered kind, the kind that doesn't carry its own documentation. That version was gone. She didn't think she would get it back, and she wasn't sure she wanted it back, because that trust had been a luxury built on not knowing the full shape of the world she lived in, and she knew the shape now. But she had come through it. She was the undisputed head of the Morty family. The succession structure was clean. The port facilities were operating. The federal investigation was proceeding. The people who had moved against her had been exposed through the very mechanisms of that exposure, through the recordings she'd made in the corridor, through the protocol her father had built, through the witnesses her father had quietly placed in the room. She had not fired a shot. She had not made a threat she didn't have the capacity to follow through on. She had not become a harder version of the people who had tried to dismantle her. She had remained herself. That was not a small thing. On the morning she brought Leonardo home to the estate, the sky was clear and cold, and the grounds were in the particular bare-boned beauty of late autumn, all the color gone, and the structure of things visible. Eleanor was waiting at the front entrance. She took Leonardo from the car seat with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this before, and held him against her chest and walked with him toward the door. And Evelyn watched them and felt something she didn't have a precise name for, but that sat in her chest as warmth rather than weight. She stood on the front steps for a moment before going inside, looked at the grounds, the paths her father had put in, the old oak, the open grass where the ceremony chairs had stood 6 weeks ago. The magnolia arch was gone. The space where it had stood was just space now, just part of the lawn, no trace of what had been there. She thought about Dante standing beneath it, confident and settled, already won. She thought about herself at the window, reading his posture, believing in the thin margin of 40 minutes. She thought about the index card in the dressing bag. She had kept it. It was in the family vault now, with the ledgers and the drives and the rest of what her father had built. She had put it there on the day she closed the vault after Okafor's team had finished their review of the contents. She had held it for a moment, before putting it in the small card, the cramped handwriting, and she had thought about how much her father had known about her, and how specifically he had loved her, and how those two things were sometimes different in the people who were supposed to be closest to you, and how rare it was when they were the same. She went inside. Leonardo was in the sitting room with Eleanor, and the sitting room was warm and full of the kind of ordinary late-morning light that has no drama in it. Just light, just a room, just a grandmother and a child and the sounds of the house settling around them. Evelyn sat in the chair across from them. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to say anything. She looked at her son. He was awake for once, the dark, unfocused gaze of a newborn, taking in the ceiling, the light, the general probable fact of the world, and she watched him and thought about what she would teach him. Not the strategy, not yet. Not the specific mechanics of how you document a betrayal or construct witness lists, or read the language buried in a succession clause. Those things would come in their time. If the life he built required them, and she thought he would have the instincts for them, because she had her father's instincts, and she believed the inheritance was real. What she wanted to teach him first was the thing that had gotten her through the morning of September 14th and all the mornings since. Not the tools, what the tools were built on. The thing her father had demonstrated in every decision he'd ever made that she'd been close enough to observe, including the last decision of his life, which was to spend his final months building something for her rather than protecting himself. That the measure of what you build is not how much it survives, but what it survives for. That power held without that understanding is just a larger version of what Dante had tried to do acquisition dressed up as protection. That the people who tried to take what was hers had failed not because she was harder than they were or more ruthless or better resourced, but because she had understood in the corridor with the locket in her hand and 11 minutes on the clock what she was protecting and why, and that understanding had been specific and unbreakable in a way that their calculations couldn't reach. She would teach him that. Everything else was machinery. Leonardo made a small sound, not crying, just the particular noise of a person announcing their own presence, that they are here, that they are real. And Eleanor looked up at Evelyn with a smile that had nothing performed in it. Evelyn looked at her son. The empire was intact. The betrayal was documented. The future was entirely, specifically hers. She had never been Dante Cuso's wife. She was Leonardo Morti's mother and Leonard Morti's daughter, and the head of everything her father had built and trusted her to keep. That was enough. That was in fact everything.